listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and other events from across these divided states and the surface of your increasingly disunited globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And from the left corner, I am your indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Good morning again, everybody. Hope you're all having a wonderful morning. It is July 13th, 7:01 a.m. Eastern. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there are about 32,105 new COVID cases reported by the United States, in the United States yesterday. There are also about 258 new deaths. 32,105 is a lot of cases. We haven't seen that many recently, and that along with other high case counts, leaves us with a 94% increase from the average 2 weeks earlier. That's an almost doubling from 2 weeks ago, Jamarl. We haven't seen these numbers in a while. 94% increase from 2 weeks ago in terms of the number of cases. 23,025 cases per day. But again, almost doubling from where we were 2 weeks ago. So yeah, it looks like we're back into the fire or the frying pan or whichever at this point. 48% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 55% of residents have received at least one dose. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 33,851,000 people across the U.S. and killed about 606,577 people. The FDA has issued a new warning to the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. In over 12 million doses administered, 100 individuals were reported as developing Guillain-Barré syndrome. This neurological disorder can cause numbness in the extremities and, in rare cases, full body paralysis. Of the 100 who developed Guillain-Barré, I wish I knew how to pronounce this one. Most were men over the age of 50 who received a shot 2 weeks prior. So unlike the earlier blood clotting problems, which seem to focus on younger women, this has to do with men over the age of 50, the exact opposite category of people, older men as opposed to younger women. Anyway, my thing on this, that's still an extremely low incidence of a problem to have for, 12 million vaccines, 1 in 100. That leaves you with an approximately 1 in 120,000 shot, if I'm doing my, 120,000 shot. That's a pretty low chance of developing a syndrome, but hey, I've said that kind of thing before. Anybody with statistical eyes to see can see that already.
Well, and that was when 5,000 people a day were dying. Awesome.
With the, oh yes. Yeah, you're talking about when I was saying, hey, we really need to push for vaccines, whatever. It doesn't matter if it's Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah, 5,000 people dying. It's dropping day to day.
It's true, but even here's the thing. This is much less the case at this point. At this point, the reason people aren't getting vaccines isn't, as far as I can tell, that there aren't enough vaccines available. It's just they don't want to get them.
Right.
And so if they were to get a vaccine, they should not be getting the Johnson & Johnson one, because we have more than enough to go around, and they should get one of the more effective ones.
Yeah.
Very simply at this point. But statistically, I'm still like, it's not that big of a deal. But I'm sorry for the people who had that syndrome. Don't want to dismiss that. In national news, over 50 House Democrats in Texas left the state in an effort to block GOP legislation that has been labeled as voter suppression. The proposed bill would ban drive-through and 24-hour voting. It would make mail-in voting more difficult and give partisan poll watchers more authority at voting sites. That move, the 50 House Democrats, their egress from Texas, that move will temporarily bring Texan legislation to a halt, as the state's House of Representatives requires a 2/3 majority of the 150 seats to be present before beginning a vote. It's also illegal under Texas law, although the applicable jurisdiction is only Texas. The people flew to Washington, D.C., but don't expect D.C. police to arrest them on Texan grounds.
Law, right.
Yeah, exactly. But I want to come back to this in a couple, after we're done with headlines. President Biden is going to Philadelphia today to give long-awaited speeches against voting law changes in Republican-led states and or voter suppression laws. He's also expected to criticize Trump's ongoing efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election, but that, he's been doing that pretty consistently. In international news, the Taliban has requested that Turkey leave the Kabul air base as a facility which was left behind by the United States, and it has been both protected and used by the Turkish government as agreed to by the U.S. just last week. The U.S. agreed to with
How was the U.S. agreeing?
that they're going to keep because we invested in the air base, Jamarl. Isn't it kind of our base? We threw money into it.
Not after we leave.
Not after we leave. Yeah,
Not after we leave.
Yeah, it's a bombed. But we can wrap up that GIF with a little bow tie, but it's either going to be shrapnel in the side of the packaging and all this stuff. It's not a good gift for leaving for them. And of course, if Turkey continues to use
issue with Turkey.
yes, well, yeah,
That is going to create a major issue with Turkey with the Taliban.
and I forget. I think it might have been I might want to come back to this, but it might have been the Reuters article that I was reading. But it was like some ostensibly, objective, prime news outlet like Reuters or AP or something like that.
Yeah.
And they were talking about this, and the way they were describing Turkey's military engagements in Iraq and Libya and these other countries, just the way they phrased it was kind of funny. I don't know. We can come back to this whole story again. More headlines to get through. The French Competition Authority has fined Google $600 million. I hear that's a record for some stuff that they've been doing. The International Olympic Committee president said that Tokyo was the best prepared host city ever for the Olympic Games. He said that this was remarkable considering how seriously the coronavirus has disrupted things around the world. China's military, specifically its Navy, apparently drove away an American warship that China says illegally entered waters near the Paracel Islands yesterday. This comes on the anniversary of an international court ruling called the Arbitral Tribunal ruling by the UN on the extent of actions that can be undertaken by China in the South China Sea. It was a lawsuit that was brought by the Philippines. Both Taiwan and China have rejected that ruling, by the way, the Arbitral Tribunal ruling, which was a big ruling in the whole South China Sea use conversation. South Africa's defense minister has said that for now there's no reason to declare a state of emergency as riots continue following the jailing of former South African President Jacob Zuma. Funerals have been taking place for the victims of a fire that swept through the coronavirus ward of a hospital in Iraq, killing about 60 people there. I've heard 58 people, over 60 people, but regardless, a lot of people already in a bad situation. Spain's equality minister has asked prosecutors to consider charging the country's most popular TikTok star on sexual offenses after the internet celebrity fessed up to duping women on whether or not he wore a condom. That's not something you want to do.
Disgusting.
That is not something you want to do. And with that, I've never seen Jamarl is very deeply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's disgusting.
Yeah.
I mean, you're basically,
Yeah.
you're lying to somebody.
It is.
Over whether or not it's like, yeah, sure, I'm going to wear it.
Exactly.
And then if you have something on the top of it.
Yeah, like an STD you're talking about. Not a sperm. Not a sperm, to be clear.
Yeah.
But men hopefully have that too. With that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yes, the 50 House Democrats leaving the state of Texas for Washington, D.C., because nothing is sure to endear them to other Texans more than leaving their state, leaving politics in a shambles, absconding to the nation's capital.
Yeah, they left. They went to D.C. So what is going to happen in D.C. now that they're here?
More good barbecue.
Are they going to be paraded about saying, look at the Texas Democrats?
Look at the Texas Democrats. They all live in Austin. These weirdos.
And all of them are moved here. Yeah, that's a wild one. So you are in, I guess, if they strongly feel like deep down that this law is over the table or over the top, and they're like, we can't do anything else here, and they abscond. It's against the law or against Texas law.
Yes.
So nothing is necessarily going to happen to them. What happens when they go back to Texas? Because invariably they're going to go back to Texas.
They get arrested.
Are they?
Yes.
Are they going to get perp walked?
I heard, I was doing my newscast looking around at this story, and yeah, apparently I heard somebody saying, I heard an official in Texas saying, when they come back, we intend to arrest them. That kind of thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's going to be interesting.
Now, that could be a right-wing fringe official who, isn't representative. But they broke a law. A lot of people broke a law.
Yeah, they broke a law, so they still may get arrested or at least fined or something like that. Look, in my head of things, all lawmakers have the capacity to do it. That's still part of the process, right? I mean, the fact that there's a law for it means that it's something that somebody has thought about. The fact that there's a law means it's part of the process. If in their heads, if there's nothing else they could do, go for it.
In Austin, they're pushing for federal voter protection in D.C. You asked what they're up to in D.C.
Yeah.
Not just going on a parade and eating good barbecue.
I see. So they're here to try to get the lawmakers actually. Oh, so they're here to try to keep people to do their jobs.
It's still losing optics, though. That's still, those are some pretty bad optics.
In
This is-
Texas,
yeah,
yes.
You got 50 Ted Cruzes who decided to take a vacation
Yeah.
from Texas at a critical moment in legislative history in the country. Decided to go over to D.C. and focus on federal
Well,
legislation.
the
I
difference-
know.
Yeah, there's a difference.
I know,
Ted Cruz absconded during a snowstorm.
Major international,
Yeah, these guys are
national
trying to
weather crisis. Yeah,
hold the line against what they consider to be voter
yeah,
suppression.
but there's optics. You get it.
Well, in Texas, yes.
Yeah,
But they're not concerned about Texas optics. They're trying to get these guys to do their
they
job in
should
DC.
be. They're state representatives. That's.
They are state representatives, but they're fighting on a very specific issue of voter protection.
I hear you.
Meaning, it's existential, and this is kind of I did a video on kind of like this. I'm sorry, I have an issue with my eyes this morning. I did a video on this last night because I was pointing out how Republicans have been very organized and they're thinking about this upcoming election. I mean, if you think about one step after the next, you have these guys, 90-something% of the voter restriction or the voter laws that have been passed by Republicans trying to do it or trying to get passed by Republicans. You had this notion of Trump coming out full bore, looking like he's still running in the campaign. I mean, some of the shots that look at Trump looks like he's still president, like either the campaign things or those type of things.
Mm-hmm.
You have Republicans screaming about critical race theory, using that as a tip of the spear, meaning that's all Fox News is running over and over and over again, or that or the border or something like that. They seem to be pretty organized and just kind of going after Democrats. Kamala Harris is basically saying, we're going to get you guys to the election, basically saying we're going to give you a pep rally and your vote matters and that stuff. That's not going to do it. Like, there's a difference in the way that they're running about the campaigns. And yeah, Democrats, they're absconding because they're trying to get federal law passed. What the Republicans are doing is existential. If I am attacking your capacity to get elected, then we're not fighting about events anymore or policy anymore. We're fighting over your ability to even get in office. And if they are going to stand there and say, we're going to give you a pep rally, well, the Texans are like, yo, we need you to pass legislation. They're going after the voting rights. They're not insane for trying to get these guys to do their jobs. The insane part is that they have to do it in the first place. Meaning the insane part is that they have to go and scream at Democrats to do your jobs. They're going after your ability to get elected in and of itself. It's existential. That's the point that I'm trying to make. The Texans, yeah, it may be bad optics. I agree. But there's something above the optics. That's my point. There's something above the theater of it all, of saying, do your job.
I still don't get it. Like, who is it existential for? Is it existential for Republicans?
The Democratic Party.
The Democrats.
Yeah. If you are going after their ability to get in office.
Yeah, because you're trying to change the voter laws.
Yeah, you're trying to change the voter laws.
But doesn't that apply the other way? Like, because Republicans' case against Democrats here, I'm trying to lay it out briefly, is that Democrats frequently pass laws that make it easier for voter fraud to happen. And that therefore, when Democrats pass laws that give people voter rights, in other words, voter fraud, as how the Republicans hear it, it's just expanding the Democrat voter base, whether it's completely fabricated votes or like illegal immigrant votes, whatever. That's the Republican claim. Isn't it existential for them too? Can't they make that claim? Can't each side make the claim that it's existential against the other?
No, that's what Republicans say. It's a difference in things, a difference in being.
That's what you say. They say.
That's what they say. I mean, I've gone over this case multiple times before. That they scream voter fraud constantly.
Without evidence for it.
Without evidence for it. And it's like you go and you look back and say, okay, each time they do analysis of the elections and everything else is like, one case, all of these people disenfranchised. Meaning, how many people are you willing to disallow to vote in order to prevent 2 cases of the voter fraud that they're claiming, or 3 cases of the voter fraud that they claim? It's that. And it's like, after a certain point of screaming this over and over again, it's like, okay, we need to have voter ID laws, and we need to have interstate cross-check to knock people off the voter rolls. And then after a while, you're like, okay, you've knocked all of these people off the rolls, or we need to curtail the number of people that can vote, or even closing polling locations. Like, all of this stuff takes place every election. Or you can use a gun license, but not a student license. That is the stuff that they do. Look, Weigel, I think it's Weigel, made the point, we don't want everybody to vote. Our odds of winning the election go up the more the voter base goes down. This was the guy for the Heritage Foundation, and that has been Republican dogma.
I get it, but you can quote one guy in one field of a party saying one thing, and that can serve as a motivation.
Don't take my word for it.
It's not evidence. That's
Go
not
back
evidence.
and look at the number of voter fraud cases.
I hear you.
And compare it to the number of people they want to disenfranchise.
We've had two main guests on about this issue from either side. And I'm going to say main guests, even though we've had more.
It's not an issue. I mean, you can look it up. It's just an evidentiary pathway that gets across, and Republicans are just making it up.
I get it.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they're making it up legitimately. And that's the thing.
I am giving Shane.
I know, but I would have to take your word on it.
You don't have to take my word on it. There's an evidentiary path. Like I said, I've done this.
But let me make my case for just a second, because I don't even know that there's a case here, which is the point. But we've had two main people on about this. One was Greg Palast, I think Greg Palast, talking about the evidence for voter disenfranchisement, basically, voter suppression. He's made that case very strongly multiple times in the show. The one time we brought somebody on from the other side was J. Christian Adams, and there was like a 10 to 15 minute, not shout out, but like aggressive back and forth between you and him. And then he never came back on. And I've literally not heard that case. It sounded like he was gearing up to make a case, but then he was pretty aggressive with you and it just devolved very quickly and he left and he hasn't ever returned. My point is, I haven't heard that side. There's probably another side there. Out of a genuine spirit of sort of good faith humanity and empathy, the assumption is, hopefully, tens of millions of people aren't making something up completely out of nothing. But, I mean, people do that. I'm not going to say we haven't done that throughout history. It's just that's the hope, is that maybe there's something there. And if there is, we should hear it. Because if there's another side to this story, it's like if we see smoke, maybe there's not a fire, but likely there's a fire somewhere. That fire is worth identifying. What's the actual evidence there? That's all I'm saying.
The fire is, how do we get elected? When people don't like our policies, that's the fire.
But the people can say that about Democrats, too.
Well, Democrats do that. I mean, look, Shane, there's a naivety here in this. Oh, well, I mean, they say this, so it has to be on some level true.
No, I'm not saying
and
that.
They say this on some level, it has to be true. That's what it sounds like.
That's taking what I'm saying
that's what it sounds
to the uncharitable level.
No, it's not.
Is that what it sounds like?
That's what it sounds like.
I'm saying
because
I haven't heard their side fully out, and we should.
Shane.
That's what I'm saying.
You can look it up. There's nothing stopping you from looking at evidence.
I haven't.
Outside of guests coming onto the show.
When you say look it up, do you know how many
I am saying
search results Google provides? Do you know how many millions of links?
It's not even search Google provides, Shane. You could say, okay, what is the evidence for the amount of fraud that they're claiming at the end of the race? You can look at it. You can say this is how much it results.
I have looked into it a little bit. And there are a bunch of claims that each side is making. And then
I didn't say claims.
Each side selectively invalidates the other side's claims. And at a certain point, I'm like, okay, I'm lost.
I'm not saying sides. I'm not talking about what Democrats, Republicans say. I'm saying just look up. You can see Washington Post, unless you're going to say, okay, Washington Post is a Democratic outlet. Then at which point it doesn't really matter anymore.
I'm not going to. No, I mean, technically, I think they would be, but I'm not. I don't use that to dismiss anything that they put forward in the same way that
no. What I mean
don't by
is,
default dismiss
if you're going to say
Fox News.
Washington Post is a Democratic organization, then at that point, anything that they put out basically is coming from a particular side. I'm saying if there is no independent arbiter in the mix, and if research or let's say evidence that they're quoting is not independent arbitration,
that's not the kind of claim I would make here. I think that you can find the truth in these things. It's not like everything is just in the dark forever. It's just it takes some work sometimes. And I've put in some work, but what I'd like to do, and what's usually a good shortcut, is to find people who've put in a lot more work than you have and talk to them,
I feel you, Shane, but not everybody is an honest arbiter. That's the catch.
I get it. But if you talk to enough people at a certain point, your spidey senses starts to tingle when they're dishonest. And then ideally you find somebody who you're like, okay, this person seems pretty laid back. They seem pretty chill. They seem like they're giving me mostly good facts. They might have a little bit of bias there, but they're even a little bit self-mocking and self-honest about it. Let's see what they have to say. If we find that person, Jamarl, that would be such a great conversation. That's my point.
Yeah. But you can also find a lot of people who are also just dishonest actors.
Yeah.
I mean, look, this issue has been around for a very long time. It's not like it's a shocking thing. This has been policy going back for 40, 50 years. I am not quite sure why you are unaware of this, but it is.
Unaware of what?
It's basic.
Unaware of which?
The thing that we are talking about here, this voter suppression stuff, is not something that has just started.
I didn't say it did or that it doesn't happen.
You seem to be unaware that this happens.
I'm saying that each side probably has some weight to its case. That is usually the case, and I want to know how much weight so I can know which side I should be listening to and which side we should be legislating towards. I don't know that right now, and neither do you, frankly. I'm guessing.
No, actually, I do.
How do you know that?
Because I've studied this for a while. you seem to be unaware of this. I don't take that position.
I know that a lot of people
unaware of this
I
issue.
know that a lot of people who have advocated
Not to mention,
for
I've
policies.
even written on this for years. But
Okay,
again,
but
I guess, look, I'm not taking issue with it. If you're unaware of it, that's fine. But that's, that's a you thing.
But you haven't laid out your case. You've just done an appeal to authority and
What are
said
you
that
talking
there's.
about? I haven't laid out my case. I've made this issue on multiple accounts. We've talked about this issue multiple accounts.
Okay, I get it. And I get it. You know what? We can do the monologue. Here's my main point is that I want to hear from the other side too, and we have not yet heard from them on this show. We have had one attempted appearance where very quickly you and the guest, and it was, I would argue, more the guest's fault, got into a fracas and it ended. Beyond that, we have not trod. We haven't gone anywhere, in that direction. We should, for the sake of due diligence, frankly, and again, a good faith appraisal of the political situation.
Shane, I don't mind if you want to bring on somebody for disinformation.
We should do
That's
it.
perfectly
Well,
fine.
for disinformation.
Because that's all it would be.
Jamarl,
There's a reality. Shane, look.
Isn't that
there's
disinformation?
no.
If you've so fully bought into one
Shane,
side that you're not willing to consider the other, isn't that disinformation? Isn't that propaganda? The kind of unconscious
I
propaganda
love
where
this idea that everybody is just, there's truth in everything.
Well,
That's nonsense. This is a political show.
Do you think I'm
And
just
there are
going to
some
give them a
people
back
that are
rub?
political actors.
I get it, but do you think that I'm going to give somebody a back rub if they come on and they're
Yes.
spouting nonsense?
Yes, because
Really?
it sounds like that's what you're doing
You
now.
have that low an estimation of me that you think I would just be like, okay, keep it going,
no,
buddy.
because I think you have this neutrality stuff that takes place that some people are being honest when those
I am
people
the
aren't.
independent person on the show.
I know, Shane, but not everything that is taking place is. It's like if you're observing the Native Americans being wiped out, and your thought is, well, there's some truth in what the people who are saying here that are wiping them out. There's some cases that people are just dishonest, and there's some cases where people want to push a political position. This is one of those cases. If you want to say that we weren't transparent voting, I'd agree with you, 1,000%. I want my elections to be transparent, and et cetera. If you want to say, however, that I want to disenfranchise a large number of people just so we can make our situation better. For example, D.C., right here in D.C., where they're like, we don't think D.C. should get voting rights. And it's like, well, why not? Because it would disenfranchise us. It would be unfair to us, and it would just be giving Democrats an extra vote. And it's like, yeah, but whether it gives Democrats an extra vote or not is secondary to the point of whether D.C. should get voting rights. Yes, I get that this is disadvantageous to you, but from an ethical sense, or even from a democratic sense, should they get the voting rights? My answer would be yes. Somebody else would say, well, I mean, that's unfair to Republicans. I mean, they're getting an extra vote.
To be consistent, they should get the voting rights. But it's also the case, a lot of the people who are probably pushing for D.C. voter rights would also push to like abolish or at least reform the Senate. So you had something more like the House of Representatives, and it was more representative of population sizes because D.C. would be one of the smallest states, to be clear, like Wyoming, like other current Republican bastions. And which is my point. A lot of the same people who are arguing for D.C. statehood also argue that we need some serious electoral reform, like, what's his name? Daniel, we have him on all the time to talk about the Constitution. I'm forgetting his name right now for a second. But
oh, I know you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. The one who says basically get rid of the Constitution.
Get rid of the Constitution, keep the preamble, get rid of everything else, and most importantly, change the Senate, because right now you have equal representation
make it
for
like a
states
parliament.
with dramatically different population levels. And I get that argument, and a lot of the people who make that kind of argument also argue for D.C. statehood. And if you were to make both of those arguments at the same time, D.C. would probably have a lot less power than it would under the current system, because it would be a very small state, even though it's the nation's capital, the seat.
What does that have to do with that particular point?
I was articulating a couple of different sides of that, like I would as an independent neutral party. I'm for D.C. statehood, not opposed to it in the slightest.
No, I guess I'm saying various actors would make the argument, Republicans, that we don't want
I get
this
it.
to be a state.
And I'll argue with them
the point of
to a
saying,
T to try to get at what the truth is, like I try to do with our guests in general. I would try to do that with somebody on the other side of this their claims of voters, not suppression, voter fraud. They would be claiming that, and I'd be like, okay, what's your case there? What's your evidence? What if you're going to say that evidence has been continuously and sort of selectively left out of the conversation? It's been covered up for years, which would be their claim, I think, because I've heard them make claims like that. Give me the evidence for that. Make your case. I would want to hear it. I'd want to kind of push them on that, because that would be interesting. If there is a case to be made there, that's going to be an interesting case to hear. In other words, we should get into it.
Look, I'm not against bringing somebody on the show for it. Like I said, we did bring the guy on. I am making the point of saying that there are political situations where people are using just fig leaves to make it.
Yeah,
I mean, we do it all the time, and it's like, okay, the terrorism. We got to go and fight terrorism. Are there some cases of terrorism on the globe? Yeah, clearly. Are we going to fight? No. No, there's a difference in those things. We can make fig leaves up just to make a political position or take a position in order to do something else. The voter fraud thing is that. And the voter suppression thing is something that tends to pop up. It's a logical process if you need to get elected. And it's unfortunate. And in cases where you would want America matter more, but this is going on in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I mean, it's just something that is old hand at this point. But look, if you find somebody that you want to bring on that you think is credible to make the case, bring them on. Bring them on.
I'd like to, because we haven't really done that yet. We tried to once and it didn't work.
Yeah, that
anyway,
devolved pretty badly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You remember it. Yeah, J. Christian Adams.
Yeah.
But
that was early on.
It was very early on. It was like the first couple of months.
On.
It was about a year ago at this point. It was the first couple of months of us coming on the show.
Yeah.
And I just remember it going poorly.
Yeah.
It was an unpleasant
I think it was 15 minutes. He said something like, well, because he wanted me to say something. And it was like, if you don't want to say that, then the show's over with. All right, the show's over with.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah.
I remember exactly how that happened. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm just sitting there. How do I do
Because
this?
it was like 15 minutes. Oh, no, it was short.
Yeah.
Very short. It was like 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that didn't go bad. That went poorly.
And you're left in the situation with me. I'm like, wait, do I intervene? Do I get involved and try to salvage this? Or do I just
Your
let
dad and I have gotten into this back and forth.
personalities work
pretty
this
heavily.
out?
I remember your dad and I got into this back and forth. And I did a video immediately after laying out all of the background data, just the reports and the experiments after the results and everything else, making this point over to like the last 10 to 15 years, especially during the Obama era when I'm studying that stuff.
Yeah.
But no.
I think one assumption that I'm not even, you need to assert this or defend this. If you were assuming, or if you would assume that like, because my dad believes that there is widespread voter fraud, that I'm going to believe that, I don't think he and I have literally talked about that topic ever. I don't think he has had like a pedagogical conversation where he's like, here's the facts, son, and he lays anything out for me like that. I don't know. I've done my own research, but what I know is a lot of people are arguing, and I would like to have a nuanced conversation with somebody who's a little bit less shrill, because a lot of the conversation about it is pretty shrill right now. That's the general, as it is with so many different topics. It's true, man. It's true. People are a little bit up in arms about that one right now.
Well, because it is existential. I mean, that's the way it's considered. I mean, if you are an African American and you were during the Bush years and you were in Florida, you were probably one of 100 and something thousand people that lost their right to vote.
Yeah.
And, this is something that took place in Wisconsin. I mean, one state after the next. And you only really need to shave off margins. And you're only talking about like 1 or 2%. And it's like, because people can make the argument, it's like, well, yeah, dude, any and everybody can get up to get a voter ID law or license. It's like, yeah, but that was put into place where there was no voter fraud. It's like, and by putting that into place, okay, you get off 1 or 2%. And yes, as a flat fact, those individuals can get themselves up, thrust their bodies to somewhere and get the thing. But what is known is that they won't. That's what's known. That's the dirty secret. That regardless of the ability to do it, that the moment that you put something like that in place, you've put up an impediment that a certain percentage of people won't overcome. And in the context of that percentage of people not overcoming, you've helped your particular candidate. It's stuff like that. And it's very aggravating. I mean, you used to have poll taxes. You used to have these other items that would just try to block or prevent people from getting into voting. And that stuff just kind of morphs into this nonsense.
And the history of our nation is in part a history of enfranchising selectively more groups of people, whether it's more men or more genders or more
actually,
races.
What the wild part is, it's the opposite in this country. It's been expanding those things.
That's what I'm saying. Enfranchising more. Yeah, getting more people involved. That's been the history. But from a point where, it was only the landowners effectively, like landowning households
that initially started.
Are able to vote, which has its own morbid kind of sense to it. But, it's not as exactly as universal as you'd expect American values to grow, at least as we view them in retrospect. But hey, one thing about voting, though, we need to go to our break. We're going to be talking about China with Ian Goodrum when we come back. What's the value of a vote, Jamarl? I'll put it like this. If somebody bribes you a donut to come out and vote, what's your vote worth? Like 90 cents? If somebody gives you $50, $100 as a bribe to come out and vote, what's it worth? If Kamala Harris, if all you have to elicit your vote is Kamala Harris on TV being like, your vote matters. Your vote matters. Get out and vote. That kind of thing. What value does that give your vote? For a lot of people, the weird thing about their votes is if I choose not to vote, it's like a person at a courtly ceremony with the anointing of the new king or whatever, refusing to bow.
Right.
If I refuse to vote, it's refusing to give legitimacy to the new reign. Which to me at this point seems more valuable, like a lot of other people see it, than actually voting. The value of a vote is greater when it's withheld, arguably, than when it's granted at this point, which is why there's a big prevalence of people boycotting the voting system. And arguably, for a good point.
Interesting.
I get that I'm going into a little loose end here, but we're talking about voter suppression and voter fraud as if our votes are like the currency of political power, but they're not. Backroom political connections are the currency of power. Votes are the ticker tape that rains down over the parade of our democracy. Anyway, that's my little spiel.
That's why Trump won.
Might be why. I don't know. They felt like a lot of people came out and voted for Trump because they were excited about him or whatever, because suddenly they felt like their vote mattered. Every new president,
Your vote did matter.
every race is an opportunity to see whether or not your vote matters.
Your vote did matter in that.
And they kind of do, but there's a conversation there. Let's go into a break so we can come back with Ian. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about China with Ian Goodrum. He's senior editor and columnist at China Daily. Follow him on Twitter at @ISGoodrum. Ian, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm great. How's everyone over there?
Good. Better for having you on. Thanks again for being with us.
Oh, thank you.
Hey, thank you. Let's talk about China here. I'm going to start with something that most Americans are familiar with, I suppose, particularly after this Richard Branson thing, although his name floats around in the air. Elon Musk, specifically Tesla. We're going to be talking about Didi. We're going to be talking about some news that popped up last week that is big and is worth paying attention to, by international observers. Anybody who uses apps, who uses technology, if you're trying to pay attention to where this stuff is going in the long run, a large part of that conversation becomes geopolitical. When you're looking a decade down the line, whether you're using an iPhone or a phone produced by Huawei, is partly going to be determined by how these geopolitical dynamics play out. Anyway, I want to get into this, but I want to start with something a little bit more familiar to an American audience, a la Tesla. Tesla has apparently been a big success in China. As far as I can tell, we're granted special rights, basically not have it being granted whole ownership and sole ownership, I believe, of their local Chinese subsidiary. That is a right not granted to many companies. Now, the word that I hear is that their fate has been turning in China, and they're facing more competition from other automakers. They're just generally having a harder time, and they're potentially going to be losing the sole right to their ownership of their local branch. Basically, what's the truth here? How big of a company in China is Tesla? How popular are their cars? And is their fate changing? Are they suddenly doing worse than they were? What's going on there, Ian?
Well, there's a few aspects to this at play. As far as the ownership, I can't say that I'm certain about whether that status is changing. They have their big gigafactory in Shanghai that they tout as being like one of the manufacturing centers for their cars, but there was an issue of having to recall quite a few cars in the country, as there were some safety issues regarding the autopilot system. There were quite a few consumer complaints, and it's hard to say. It's a chicken and egg situation where it's I think certainly that factored into the new hurdles that Tesla are facing, and that the kind of enormous weight of the consumer complaints spurred action on behalf of regulators. But it's also something to consider, especially with Tesla. You consider, and this is not the only thing that's going on with regard to Tesla, but it's a good microcosm. Elon Musk's personal attitude toward American regulators and his attitude toward Chinese regulators, right? He's dismissive of U.S. auto regulations, industry regulations, the antitrust, any kind of law that would restrict his ability to launch a car into space or launch a bunch of cars into space or whatever his latest plan is. And he is very much deferential to Chinese regulators when he talks about his operations in China. And I think there's an understanding that there is a much more difficult. He's on very thin ice, as I think many foreign capitalists are in China, and so to toe the line is seen as essential. Whereas in the U.S., as far as those, the supposedly all-powerful government is concerned, he can be a little bit more cavalier. But there was an enormous product recall of almost 300,000 cars. There's been a lot of concerns over the quality of the vehicles, the pricing of the vehicles, all these
real
things.
Quick,
I mean,
on that recall,
yeah.
Ian, there's a point of fact here that I want to bring into question for a second. Was the recall a physical recall, or was it like just a software update? This is a key thing, because what I've heard was there was a software glitch in the Tesla cars, but then they did a physical recall. In other words, that seems unnecessary. If you have a software glitch, you can, I would assume, update. You don't need to update the hardware, or the firmware, whatever. You can just roll out an update.
Right. It's what would be called a soft recall. I didn't mean to imply that it was they were all getting shipped back to the factory.
That's the thing. I had heard that they were, and at this point just seems like a misinformation from the outlet that was publishing it. But I remember specifically they were saying it was a hard recall. It was a physical recall of the cars. It just seems like they got that wrong. Is that right, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, this particular one, the biggest one is a software update. But the issue was causing a lot of problems. I mean, and it's not the only issue with the cars. There's been price changes that have infuriated Chinese customers. There's been quite a lot of backlash on behalf of the average car buyer, and this is in a country. It's not like. Certainly, the brand has cachet in China, and it is seen. It doesn't have maybe the same level as it might in the U.S., where in like Southern California, the Tesla is the thing to have. To both show that you're driving an electric car, but you're also driving a really expensive electric car. It's popular. There are charging stations. I mean, you see them occasionally, but I don't think they're as much the thing to get in China, because there are a lot of competitors, because China has many companies that produce new energy vehicles, electric cars, plug-in hybrids, all the varieties. And so Tesla faces an uphill battle in terms of getting a foothold in this market, because there are domestic producers that produce vehicles at the same level of quality and at much lower prices, because the Teslas are heavily taxed. They're just like all luxury goods are heavily taxed, and the prices reflect that. And so there's also lots of subsidies for domestic producers, and so it's a difficult situation. And these domestic brands don't have the same kind of complaints that Tesla's been seeing. Mm-hmm. So they're having difficulty, but I would say it's a crisis of it's more a crisis of their own making than anything that China has done sort of unilaterally. And that's because of Elon Musk's temperament. So what has the political situation been for Tesla in the country itself? Meaning the wording, the politicians, what have they been saying about the government? Because I would imagine there has to be something that's being said or that's being done to undermine them. And I know, yes, this complaint, but I would imagine it's more than just the complaint. I get the feeling that the complaint may not necessarily entirely be a actual glitch, is the point that I'm getting at. From a standpoint of media and everything else, what has been the conversation? Has Tesla been part of this kind of whirlwind that has been undermining the product itself also? Well, I mean, they've dropped the price, I believe, of the Model Y to attempt to make good on some of these complaints. It's a shorter range, but it is a lower price. And so one of the big complaints was just how expensive the cars are. And so this is an attempt to sort of make up for that. It's kind of a what am I trying to say? It's kind of a sop. I don't know how effective it's going to be, but I think the brand has taken on a certain amount of toxicity. Yes, because of these viral complaints that have spread around on the Chinese internet. The general distrust of some foreign brands and some foreign capitalists. I mean, there have been. Well, one more take on this real quick. Is it also just the pressure that's put on China from the U.S.? Meaning,
is Tesla feeling heat from a backlash of sorts? I mean, we've went so far as to say these guys are committing genocide. And so it's like, if you know that, and if you know they've been attacking you, your products, your brand names, et cetera, in the United States, does that cast a dark light on American products in China? And Tesla being kind of a key one.
I mean, that could be a factor. I wouldn't say it's the factor. I would say that if it is something that is having an effect, it's one of many. This for the same reason that there hasn't been like a plummeting in terms of iPhone sales in China, but there has been a leveling off and an increase in domestic purchasing of domestic brands. So there are some effects that we see in terms of people's preferences. But that can be, there's many explanations for it, not simply the rejection of American brands per se, just on their face for being American brands, but also the fact that the Chinese alternatives are now, just as good, and less expensive and last longer, especially when it comes to phones. And I would assume, I don't drive a car here. I just take, as related as we may want to talk about Didi later, I take the subway or rent a bike, but certainly in terms of what I see around, there's plenty of domestic brands sharing the road with the marquee names you might know in the States or elsewhere.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah. And kind of wrapping this up and segueing into Didi, we had a conversation about Silicon Valley and Wall Street and just the relationship between America's financial and sort of innovative centers, how China's dealing with them, how they're pushing back, in the same way that the U.S. pushed back against Huawei, and it's on, sort of proportional tit for tat kind of reciprocal concerns that part genuine, I'm sure, and also probably part performative to send messages with, Huawei and Didi, these kind of reciprocal bans back and forth. But I want to focus on Silicon Valley for just a second, bridging the gap with Tesla. A lot of people in Silicon Valley, specifically the more right-leaning ones that I've noticed, will talk frequently about China and Chinese influence in Silicon Valley, them buying out, majorly investing in tech companies, buying out tech companies in some cases, broadly influencing them. There's a big hubbub about that right now. How much of a there is that? What do you see Chinese influence in Silicon Valley being? How much money do you see from China? How much of a topic of conversation do you see Silicon Valley being in China? You have your own local innovation centers in that country. There are plenty of big industrial centers, but obviously Silicon Valley, that's the world's capital, at least in terms of app development, a lot of the, online infrastructure. How much of an emphasis does the Chinese government seem to place on there, and how much of an emphasis does the Chinese investor class place on Silicon Valley, as far as you can see, Ian?
Well, it depends on whether we're talking about Silicon Valley in terms of the making apps or actually making stuff. And so I think it's a broader perspective of thinking about the kind of technological and bottlenecks that may exist in terms of comparing the industry in China and the US. So obviously things like key components like semiconductors, these chipsets that are essential to power all kinds of advanced computing technology, microprocessors. Those are highly protected products. But the desire is to catch up, right? To catch up in every regard. And so that includes the digital space, and that includes kind of learning what they can from tech companies in the US and then innovating from there. So we have, going back to Didi is similar to Uber with some key differences in that it's, I think the worker protections are significantly better, but there are attempts to kind of learn what they can, make use of what they can, and so that might involve purchasing or investment in order to get a better look at what's going on. People can whine and complain about it, but it's perfectly legal to do that. And so there is a desire to not just catch up in the realm of the key technological components, which is of course a top priority for the infrastructure and R&D spending that the government does, but also in terms of catching up in the digital area. And so now we have apps like WeChat, which is an Omni app, and Alipay, which is still, despite the anti-PO being shut down, is still a thriving and successful app in China, and these apps have many other apps, sub apps or mini programs within them that you can use to do basically everything. So I mean, I think that's one innovation that China has, a leg up that China has in terms of its digital development over the U.S., where there's a very balkanized app space.
And you're talking about, at least in part there, about like fintech, which would come under particular, particularly sensitive concerns about privacy and how exactly you're handling the data. And the IPO that you're talking about, again, that mirrors what's happening now with Didi, which we'll come back to. We're going to go into a break here. But Didi, I believe it's Qisheng. How do you pronounce the second part of that?
Didi Tuxing.
Tuxing? Okay.
Yeah.
Basically, Didi, a ride-sharing app, like you're talking about. Think of it as a Chinese version of Uber. Although from what you said, it has better voter, pardon me, not better voter, better worker protections. It's a better environment for the actual drivers in the app. Anyway, they did an American IPO recently. There's been a sharp backlash from the Chinese government. This is what's tying the whole conversation with Silicon Valley. We're going to be coming back talking about that with our guest, Ian Goodrum. For those listening, Ian Goodrum is senior editor and columnist at China Daily. Follow him on Twitter at @ISGoodrum. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So we're having a conversation with Ian Goodrum. Ian Goodrum is senior editor and columnist at China Daily. You can follow Ian on Twitter at @ISGoodrum. Ian, thank you for joining us, and especially on this conversation. When we hit upon this conversation about Didi the other day, and just so we're clear, like you said, it's a ride-sharing app. The question became this notion of tech versus communist government, and how on some level having a tech sector or this kind of tech industry runs almost, I don't want to say in opposition, but there's a contradiction there in having a communist party having to work in concert with this almost juxtaposition of these things. And you see this kind of crackdown on Musk or the crackdown on the tech sector in and of itself. And the question becomes, how does China maintain those two things? How does it maintain this notion of, okay, we have a communist party, the state and the government is going to maintain power and control over these various sectors of government and of society, while simultaneously we are going to have this kind of, let's say, capitalistic sector where we're going to put a noose or a rope around it and we're going to ride it. And we're going to get the benefits out of it while trying to minimize the, let's say, depravities of that system. Well, you have this massive income inequality. You have a tech sector. You have, let's say, a financial sector. And those things do, on some level, seem to contradict communist, let's say, just in ideology of the world. How does the government maintain that juxtaposition, if that makes sense? I hope the question makes sense. It just seems like it's somewhat of a difficult, let's say, a difficult path to walk or a difficult road to tread to maintain. Well, okay, we're going to make, but just one last point. The power dynamic is the thing that I'm getting at. The moment that you have this kind of income inequality and you allow this financial sector, don't you on some level cede power in order to even have that sector in the first place?
Well, I mean, there's a few things to say there. The best metaphor for the Chinese economy is actually comes from Qian Yuan, one of the elder heads of state of both pre-reform and post-reform China, who supported reform to an extent, but was also, a devoted communist and a believer in the need for regulatory control. he likened the Chinese economy to a bird in a cage. So the idea is that the bird is the so-called free market, the private sector, and you have a cage. You have a cage that's not so small that the bird can't fly around and move, but not so big that the bird can fly through the bars of the cage. So in order to maintain this kind of equilibrium, you have to maintain the superiority, the absolute authority of the state and the Communist Party as the leading, as the vanguard of the working class, as the most advanced elements of the working class, as a representative of the people of China. And so we're seeing right now this kind of a demonstration of this in action. Right, because it's true. For a time, there was what the CPC calls the disorderly expansion of capital, right, and the consolidation of wealth and power. And now we're seeing through these antitrust, these kind of antitrust measures, excuse me, just regular antitrust, through these antitrust measures, through these things, through these regulatory crackdown, I guess is a sensationalistic way to say it, but it is in a sense. Preventing this disorderly expansion and preventing this consolidation of power, breaking up these conglomerates, limiting their authority and limiting their control. So, as regards Didi, there were two things of concern. One was the nature of the monopoly that they were potentially creating, the tech monopolies that are in the sort of embryonic stage and kind of shutting that down at great cost. There's an estimates that the loss is going to be in the billions and billions of dollars in terms of what will be lost by restricting these companies either before or after they've had their IPOs, because those are obviously big money makers. So they're taking the economic cost because they want to protect against the monopoly formation that we see in your standard capitalist economy. And also, as regards Didi, the protection of Chinese users' privacy and their data. And there is legislation in the works right now, similar to the legislation in Europe that protects people's private data, that will become a much stronger protections of user data in the tech industry. In that there is a sense that the tech industry has had free reign for too long, and now there is a need to kind of beat that back. And this is the form it's taking. The form it's taking is restriction of some of these big apps and ensuring that if there is an IPO, if these companies do have entanglements in the U.S. and other countries, that they're not exposing their users' data to intelligence backdoors, security breaches, all the things that the U.S. crows about that they haven't found any evidence for with Chinese apps and Chinese technology. China's now doing with its own companies to prevent that from happening. And so we're seeing right now kind of a blitz of this activity, and it manifests right now in Didi, and it manifested just a couple months ago in Ant.
But isn't that kind of you're saying that they're doing this to restrict these companies' ability to monopolize the space that they would otherwise monopolize? In other words, in a normal capitalist mode, like you see in the United States, these companies would go full hog or whatever. They would expand and control the space. They'd take it over, and then they'd have a monopoly on it. And it would be up to a government like the United States or like China to come in and trust bust them. That's the claim. This is pre-monopoly, and you could argue that they're nipping it in the bud or something. But is that really what's going on here? Or is it closer to what Jamarl was saying, that the government sees this rival power center, an independent political player? And isn't it, if it's more that than just monopoly, isn't that a measure of the Chinese government's view of its own weakness? If they're stopping it here, in other words, if this is how far they're willing to ride the horse, then they're saying they can't ride it further, or at least they don't trust themselves to. They're not willing to get the billions of dollars of growth that you said a couple of minutes ago they would get out of the future growth of these companies. They've decided, no, it's time to send it to the stable right now. What am I missing there, Ian?
Well, I mean, you can characterize it that way, I suppose. But for me, I think about this is I think the CPC are good materialists. I think that they're Marxists, and they think about. And it's not just about what the maximum, because the monopolies aren't a problem. Private monopolies aren't a problem in a capitalist economy, right? And so we willingly let Google and Amazon and Apple and Facebook and whomever else just hoover up our data and sell to advertisers, which might seem relatively benign, but it's not really.
Well, we do it with a lot of toing and froing about it. We did the Microsoft antitrust suit, and we're talking about it with the others, but we'll see.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I think that you could say that it's a rival power center, but what would that rival power center do? It would privatize. It would attempt to continue to eat up the surplus value of the country. I think those are very negative consequences. And so the Chinese government thinks about the social consequences of these actions. It's not just about, dollars and cents. It's about what the social impact of these monopolies would be. It's about what the consequences would be for the greater populace. And I think in that sense, it's perfectly justifiable to say, okay, this has gone on long enough. I mean, this is a common talking point among Bernie Sanders progressives in the U.S. It's not an unusual problem.
No,
it's just that China is in a position to actually do something about it.
Yeah, because fact of the matter is, at the point where they get to be, Google, or the point where they get to be, Amazon, it's too late. I mean, it's like, because is there a way to corral that? I mean, that's the interesting problem, like you said, we're having here in the United States. How do you corral Google, and then do you break them up? But here's the catch. For something like Google, we have so many capabilities that are associated with Google. I guess the catch becomes, if you don't allow a company to get to that size. For example, let's say like Amazon. Amazon is now doing all of the space stuff. But see, even that's not a great argument for it.
Amazon's doing a bunch. Jeff Bezos pursuing Blue Origin, but Amazon and Microsoft are competing over these. This is where the argument kind of breaks down, in my opinion. Google and Amazon and even Facebook, to a lesser extent, the social media companies are all in not just cahoots, but are all part of the broader large G government. Right.
Sure.
From a certain perspective, that's ridiculous, of course, but I think you guys both get what I'm saying. The degree of not just through the congressional hearings, but if you just look at social media, the degree of apparent collaboration between the political parties, whether it's the DNC or the RNC, their influence on what these outlets choose to do, what these companies choose to do, not to mention Google, the revolving door between the military-industrial complex and the boards of these companies, with Eric Schmidt going in and out, the current CEO of Alphabet. I'm forgetting his name, but we were just talking about him the other day. It's a revolving door of people operating within the same context. That is the oligarchy. Doesn't that work? Isn't there a kind of brutal way in which that works, Ian, that the Chinese government could learn something from? And maybe I don't want them to, but the corporatism and a strong government working with each other, I think is technically called fascism. Isn't there an edge in that for America? Why do you think that doesn't work for us, Ian?
Well, I mean, because of the basic tendency of the rate of profit to fall, the need for monopolistic private monopolies to continue to find sources of surplus value, the need for those monopolies to continue to exploit the working class. I mean, expanding their reach internationally. This is why we get, it's a long and convoluted process, but it's A leads to B leads to C. So we have big monopolies forming, B, C, and then bombing foreign countries and killing people. It may seem abstract, but this is the end result. So if you have a government that's in capture to those interests and in capture to the rapacious need for endless profit, then you will have these kinds of unilateral actions that end in human suffering. Whereas if you have a government that prioritizes social, has a social value, considers the social benefits or consequences of an action, you have a limit to what that profit motive can do, as we're seeing. There's been no issue. There has been kind of the national champions model of subsidizing and building up large companies to perfect their product and their services, and then to sort of rein them in. I think that's a fairly reasonable way of doing it, because then you get the mega app, but the mega app that can't do whatever it wants with your data, right? You get the best of both worlds. So I think, for me personally, I don't see an issue. I think it's perfectly fine.
I hear you.
Yeah. All right. I tend to agree. Like I said, I was trying to frame the argument before, but I realized, well, you can have an Amazon-like capability without necessarily having Amazon, or you can have like a Uber capability. Right. It was that stuff. That's kind of where I head on.
Instead of having two monopolies, you want to have one. Instead of having a monopoly on force with the government and a monopoly on that app with Amazon or whatever company we're talking about, you want the government to have both, which from my American eyes is a lot more skeptical. I'm like, okay, I don't know that I want there to be a single entity that does both of those things. But if you view government as the arbiter of the public good and like the thing that intermediates that stuff, then I get the arguments for it. That's what a lot of this comes down to. Anyway, Ian Goodrum joining us, senior editor and columnist at China Daily. Follow him on Twitter at @ISGoodrum. Ian, thank you so much. Great conversation. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning show. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited cosmos. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would strongly imply that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. Interesting conversation with Ian. I love that. I always describe this stuff as power centers. I always describe it that way because that's what it seems to be. If you have the church, you have the state, you might have a corporate sector. Something else may spring up, may have its own thing. And I don't mean it's like just kind of, like priest. No, I mean like almost like an industry of sorts. Because I don't know if you can call the church an industry, even though you kind of could. But if you're talking about like in the old days where you would have church as something that may rival state. And it's like, which one do we worship? Do we worship or do we go to state?
Not just rival, but the papacy was a stronger force than a lot of states.
You're right. That's kind of my point.
1300s,
Yeah.
1400s, 1500s. Of course, then you have the devolution of these things. And instead of having one pope, you got 3 anti-popes all at once or whatever. And things kind of break down. But yeah, the church, and it is an industry. If you look at all these monasteries, you have local monasteries that produce things and sell them to make money for themselves, and then you have tithes and this larger process of courtly participation and stuff. They are an industry. They make money. They extract wealth. They were a kind of super government, like the United Nations. Not saying they approach that moral caliber, but you get the universal sort of international body.
I guess that's what I'm getting at. I think if it's an industry, it's not a rival. What I mean is, at the time where you had government and you had a situation where state whether church either rivaled or stronger than, well, at that point, it's something else. It's like, what is state? Is state an industry? No, state is something else. It's kind of that. When it reached that level, it seems to be this kind of thing of being able to take it off. Because if you tell somebody, hey, all right, go and arrest the Pope or whatever, and they're like, yeah, we're not going to do that. Well, at that point, you've lost the capacity to have control over the Pope. You're no longer sovereign. There's something else that's above you in that. But if it becomes an industry, that means it's lessened itself. It becomes something else, like the corporate sector. The corporate sector, at some point, it's a power center. I mean, I don't know what else you call it. When you have all of this money and all of this power concentrated in the hands of a very small body of human beings, well, that rivals state. Where you have the capacity to say, look, we'll give you cash to do this. And you can influence as opposed to the state having a certain degree of control. That's a rival power center. That's what I mean when I say it pushes, like it's like state, church, corporate, those seem to be sectors, if that makes sense. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Like it seems to go a little bit beyond just the individual industry of a particular
I
thing.
hear what you're saying.
Yeah. It's like a galaxy versus a planet.
Industry as a whole is its own kind of sector. You can think of it, and especially when you get corporate conglomerations and these big things. And I hear you.
Yeah, they get their own point of view. They have their own way of framing of the world and everything else. And they have their own
incentives, their own modes, their own ideologies.
Yeah.
They create their own governments if given the opportunity to, all these sorts of things. They're their own bodies, political bodies built out of people that would go in their own direction like a machine.
Yeah, they're trying to make money. They got a state. One of those places gave it a place to govern. Yeah. But no, great conversation with Ian. He got real edgy. He was like, what power sector? What do you mean? Sovereign. All right, let's keep going. I always said this, none of it's real. And that's what it's like. Well, they don't have any claim from a cosmic sense. It's people coming together and saying, okay, we're going to come together. We're going to do something for the interest of the public, et cetera, et cetera. Great. But within that, you have other groups of people that can come together and create their universe. So let's get headlines. In the news, About 32,105 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were about 258 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 23,025 cases per day, an increase of 94% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 48% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 55% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 33,851,623 people across the United States and has killed 606,577 human beings. The FDA has issued a new warning to the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. And over 12 million doses administered, 100 individuals were reported as developing the Guillain-Barré syndrome. The neurological disorder can cause numbness in the extremities and, in rare cases, full body paralysis. Of the 100 who developed Guillain-Barré, most were men over the age of 50 who received one shot 2 weeks prior. That's unfortunate. Over 50 House Democrats in Texas left the state in an effort to block GOP legislation that had been labeled as voter suppression. The proposed bill would ban drive-through and 24-hour voting, make mail-in voting more difficult, and give partisan poll watching more authority over voting sites. The move would temporarily bring Texan legislation to a halt at the state of House of Representatives requires a 2/3 majority of the 150 seats to be present before beginning a vote. This is also illegal under Texas law, although the applicable jurisdiction is only in Texas. Poll watching. They're going to get poll watchers. That's great. That has an awesome history. President Biden is going to Philadelphia to give speeches against voting law changes in the Republican-led state and/or voter suppression, and is expected to criticize Trump's ongoing efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. The Taliban has requested that Turkey leave the Kabul Air Base, a facility which was left behind by the United States and has been both protected and used by the Turkish government, as agreed to by the United States last week. Turkey has more than 500 soldiers in Afghanistan, and the Taliban has said that it would consider any foreign troops on Afghan soil after withdrawal of NATO as invaders. The International Olympic Committee president said Tokyo was best prepared host city ever for the Games, saying this was remarkable considering how seriously the coronavirus had disrupted things. China's military drove away an American warship that it says it illegally entered waters near the Parcel Islands yesterday. This comes on the anniversary of an international court ruling called Arbitral Tribunal ruling by the UN on the extent of actions that could be taken by China, a lawsuit brought by the Philippines. Both Taiwan and China have rejected that ruling. South Africa's defense minister has said that for now, there's no reason to declare a state of emergency as riots continue following the jailing of former South African President Jacob Zuma. Funerals have been taking place for the victims of a fire that swept through the coronavirus ward of a hospital in Iraq, killing more than 60 people. And last, Spain's equity minister said the prosecutors has asked prosecutors to consider charging the country's most popular TikTok star on sexual offenses after the internet celebrity fessed up to duping women on whether or not he wore a condom. That is horrible. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening in the Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I saw Shane putting in one. Here we are. The French Competition Authority has fined Google $600 million for failing to negotiate in good faith with media outlets. Good. Applause.
Google getting fined. This has to do with this thing called the neighboring right. It's an EU copyright law, copyright reform thing they have, which I'm going to quote here, grants press publishers a right to ask for a remuneration when their content is displayed on online platforms.
Yeah.
End quote. And Google apparently, France has signed on to this. Google didn't do that.
Yeah.
They haven't apparently granted that remuneration. So they're getting fined for this. And there you go.
Yeah. Failing to negotiate in good faith. The Afghan one is interesting. So America basically says, all right, guys, you can take this base. Now,
To Turkey.
if you remember, in Bagram Air Force Base, when we left silently.
And it got
the place
looted.
got raided. Right.
It got looted
It
immediately.
got looted.
after.
Got
Yeah.
almost looted immediately, which is funny to me. It's like people are like, they're gone. All right, let's take
take
let's
it,
raid
take
the joint.
everything.
Right, let's take it all.
Take it all.
Let's leave it on stones or cement blocks. So I guess, all right, Turkey, we're going to give this to you. We're going to leave, etc. Great. And Taliban is like, yeah, you better leave. That's going to be our base. You
Yes.
need to leave.
Yeah.
And if Turkey says no, they've already said anybody that is here is going to be basically an enemy.
Yeah.
Now, what is Turkey going to do? What is Erdogan going to do? Is Erdogan going to give up his ambitions in Afghanistan that seem to be in Afghanistan, considering he decided to take the base? Or is he going to leave as told? Like, this is what's fascinating about this. And I know some people would say, well, hey, man, because that's a problem, you should just stay there forever. No, that's the wrong way to look at it.
Who says that?
Yeah, the fact that you went in is the problem.
That's the implication of what a lot of people say, but I don't think anybody bluntly says that quite
John
that much.
McCain made this argument that we stay forever in Iraq. I'm talking about in the previous war. It was like, how long should we stay? He's like, 100 years.
Forever.
If you remember, that was a
Yes,
famous
yeah.
quote. Yeah, forever. Because because the problem is you've broken something the moment that you go in. Now, the idea is that people are convinced that when you leave, everything is going to be roses and rainbows. And when you leave the stable government and everything is great. That's not the way it typically happens. I know, after the last war, let's say the big war, let's say the Second World War, well, we built up with the Manhattan Project or Manhattan Plan. No, is that right? It's not the Manhattan Project. The
Manhattan
Manhattan Project.
Yep.
I forget the name of the plan. But whatever the plan, Marshall Plan.
Marshall Plan, exactly.
Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
But we built those governments up. Like, Japan, Germany, they became allies and everything else. That's not what happened in Afghanistan. And that's not, I would say, even entirely what happened in Iraq on some level. I mean, we just built a country that was just for our benefit. But from the standpoint of Afghanistan, that's not what happened at all. I mean, that's not what we're leaving. We're leaving kind of like in Vietnam, where there was a hostile enemy that we basically lost in this kind of siege war against because it was their country. They weren't going to leave, and they were hell-bent on us leaving. So we're leaving, and it's falling. And the catch becomes, is Turkey going to be there afterwards? And what does it mean if they do? I mean, what is Turkey going to help the Afghan government to fight the Taliban? Is that what's going to take place? Are they going to pick it up kind of like we picked up Vietnam from the French?
But that would be a losing move for them, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would be insane. I mean, at least I think it would be insane. Who knows what Erdogan wants?
No, but that seems like that would be insane.
Yeah.
Unless he wants a constant battlefield to keep his soldiers on their toes or something, to keep them trained and in fighting form. But no, that doesn't seem like a very good move. That doesn't seem like that's enough for it.
No, it doesn't. We are going to get into a really good conversation on Cuba. I was looking around for somebody to talk to about Cuba because everything that was taking place. Basically, there have been protests. The protests have been on, I think it's the COVID vaccines, and it was something else. Someone kind of
the economy and
the
apparently
economy.
the leadership of the new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel.
Right. So this is the first president that is not Castro.
In like 70 years.
Yeah, he's been the cat. So when they're talking about the revolution, that's what they're talking about. Like, because it sounds weird to us because we've had multiple leaders. But if you think about it, you've had a revolution that basically set the course of the country, the context of the country.
You had three leaders and really just one. Just one.
Right. That's it. And so it's like, from the standpoint of a revolution, that is still going on in their headspace of this is what's taking place. And if after the revolution you have sanctions that dramatically curtail the supplies and what your country can bring in, you could still be in the headspace. I mean, like I said, the country supposedly looks like a time warp. And if you're an American, that embargo is famous. It's infamous. Like, and Obama was the one to take it off and everything else. I've always wanted to go. And I remember when Obama got in office and he moved the embargo, it was like, oh, good. You kind of get the opportunity to go. And then Trump gets back in and it's like, yeah, no. And it's back on. And it's like, we're going to force you to do what? We're going to force you to do what? It's like you get 50 years, 60 years of trying to force a country to do what? And then after a while, it becomes, well, the embargo is there, so the embargo has to stay there. And it's that. The gentleman that comes on is going to give us a rundown of basic Cuban history. Basically what happened before the revolution, what happened after the revolution. Because my thought was we needed a context. Yeah. I thought we needed a context that basically we can.
And we should get into it when we get to him. Yeah. Just in just a couple minutes here, we're going to be talking about colonialism. We're going to be talking about the history there. I'm sure at least for a couple of minutes, we're going to be talking about the pre-revolutionary period,
Yeah.
how the United States was involved, the casinos down there,
Yeah.
the drugs,
Right.
organized crime, that whole thing.
Crops. I mean, because eventually we were basically using it as a sugar colony.
Yes. Yeah.
And revolution. Now the catch becomes,
and a sugar colony, but also like a vacation resort
yeah,
for Americans.
Right.
You know, you build up as like a vacation tour in the same way that we were doing with like Hawaii.
Yeah.
You know, and specifically, you go there and you can gamble. And I think during Prohibition, you can drink too.
Yeah.
It becomes one of the places during Prohibition where you can't drink in the States, but you can, you know.
Yeah, you can go there
Go down
and
to
have
Cuba and
that particular thing.
Have a couple of weeks.
So the catch becomes, and somebody made the point, it's like, you're okay with authoritarianism? And I'm like, because Margaret Kimberly is one of our guests that comes on, and she had put on this tweet. And the tweet had said something like, I think she was showing the protests or the counter protests to the people who were protesting, basically people who were supporting the government. And the president went out basically saying, go back and support the revolution. And like to Americans, that sounds weird. It's like, what? Go revolution? What are you talking about? It's like 70 years, man. But that's what he's talking about, right? And so the guy, I retweeted her because I often retweet stuff so I can go back to it later as a reference point. Twitter's like my place of keeping that stuff together. And I responded to the guy. I was like, look, that's poor framing. That's basically shallow framing. No, I'm not necessarily in support of authoritarianism. What I'm in support of is us not being involved in either knocking over governments or trying to set the course of political discourse in other countries. I was like, there's a difference in those things. I was like, if we are knocking over governments, let's say in Syria, or knocking over governments in South America, I am against that. And if you are for that, then you need to own the consequences of that. At which point, he's like, what are you talking about? My point is, dude, it's not as straightforward as, are you in support?
Of course not. It's a loaded question.
Yeah, it's a loaded question.
It's a loaded question. It's
and so I reloaded the question when I sent it back to him. He was like, what? You don't know anything about me. I was like, well, I know something about you from the standpoint of the framing of your question. If you're going to frame it that way and you're going to throw it at me.
But there is something ridiculous about Miguel Diaz-Canel, the president of Cuba right now. Again, I get it. 70 years ago is a while for us, maybe. For them, it's not so long ago. There's effectively one leader, Fidel Castro, in the vast majority of that period.
Right.
And for a lot of people, there's this generational thing where people, the revolution has a special, memory for them. I'm sure that it doesn't for us. We're not
kind of like the civil rights movement here.
But isn't he calling for some people to fight with other people, his own citizens in the streets?
Yes.
Isn't that what he's doing? Imagine if Trump were to do that. Again,
yeah, but this is not America. I mean, it's a different country. It's a different context.
I get it, but we're talking as Americans. We're not talking as Cubans. That's all we can do, and we can judge it as Americans, and not to get involved, not to intervene, not to do anything than express our, voice, say what we have to say about it, whatever.
Yeah, but the judgment of, if you're going to use your own context to judge something that is not within your context, it's going to always look weird.
I wouldn't do it I wouldn't do it to try to change them. All I would do is to set in stone for myself. How do I think about this? What thoughts do I have about this? And then when we talk to the Cuban history professor, we probably won't focus on the politics of it, although that'd be a very interesting conversation. We'll probably focus a little bit more on the history, but still get into it with them. We're going to get into that when we come back from this break. We're going into our break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And from what I understand, we are currently working to bring our next guest in. We're trying to get on Benito Albiza. He's the professor at Universidad de La Habana, and he works at coordinator at Cuban Trails. We're going to be talking about Cuban history with him. We're in the process of trying to get him on right now. Any luck there so far, Jamarl?
We're
still working on it, basically.
Yeah, we're still working on it. I was able to contact the gentleman yesterday. I was looking around for someone, and I was trying to find schools, universities, etc. And eventually I thought to myself, well, if you were traveling, what would you look for? Like a Cuban professor or something like that. And I stumbled across a traveling place that had a walking or tours. And in the context of the tour, oh, good. And so in the context of the tour, we had this thing where the guy comes on. I found the site, and the website basically says, traveling history professor giving tours of Cuba. And he was in Havana. And
That sounds very cool.
Yes. I was like, yes. Like if I was there, this would be something that I would do because I would want like kind of a history of the location. And so it just so happened I was able to find Benito. And he was very nice. I mean, I talked for a bit. He said, I just want to talk and give the history of the location and history of the area. And I was like, perfect. I said, that's all we want. We just need a living history of Cuba. What happened? When did it happen? Before the revolution and after. For myself, I know when I'm looking at stuff like this, I try to get a context for what happened and just somewhat of a basic history of what happened. And then it's like from that, you can kind of build on. I think in the U.S., I did it backwards. I went into well, no, it was the same way. Why is this the way it is? And not just the basic history. At some point, you eventually evolve to the politics of it. Why were they doing what they were doing? And oftentimes what you would find would be that there are often other forces that are engaged in the politics of a particular area than just the basic people in the area itself. And Cuba is definitely no different in that context. I think the thing is, we have played a big, big role in Cuban history. And it's one of those things where, from my standpoint, time to stay out of it. Time to stay out. I get a lot of people like, we need to get involved. Like in Mexico, like in Florida, you have some people who are saying we should get more involved and whatnot. And it's like, we've been involved. We've been involved long enough. Let issue for Cuba remain the Cubans. That's the way I am with this stuff. In fact, that's where I'm with a lot of politics from the standpoint of us engaging and interacting with international bodies of human beings.
And we are currently working. We're working on getting the guest on, by the way.
Oh, excellent.
We've just heard from him. It's apparently a little technical kink or something like that. But
okay.
That is in motion.
Excellent. Yeah. So that should be a great conversation, especially before the revolution. I've been to, let's see, where was I? Where was I? Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has its own factory. They give this thing about what it was like in Cuba. It's an alcohol factory. I can't think of the name of it. It'll come to me in a few. But Havana, Cuba. What is the drink that's associated with Havana, Cuba?
For some reason, rum.
Rum. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So there's a Bacardi rum factory in Puerto Rico, and the Bacardi rum factory has like pictures and images and everything else of what it was like to be in Havana, Cuba, for rum during that time before.
Cool.
Yes. In the 1920s, before prohibition, before the revolution took place in Cuba.
And Andre, our engineer, has been to Cuba himself.
Oh, have you, Andre?
With Minio, you said? That's funny. Yeah,
very nice.
A couple years ago, I remember seeing this.
Yeah, I've wanted to go. But the Havana factory, the rum factory, they were given this kind of, this is what the history of it was like. This is what the people was like. It was very cool.
You bought me a Cuban cigar recently.
Yes, I did buy you a Cuban
in
cigar.
Geneva, I believe it was in Geneva or Milan. I smoked that on
the cops are going to come here and walk me out of here. No, it's like, where's the cigar? No. Where's the cigar?
And then again, I smoked it on the 4th of July,
right.
Which is a little bit ironic, I guess. But it was a good cigar.
I'm glad. But yeah, man, that was, the Cuba thing is very interesting. I mean, look, the reason why I say it's a different context is because people who went through this kind of revolution against what they would call imperialistic forces. And we did, but everybody who we know have died long ago for stuff like that.
It's about 3 times as long, no, more than that, like four times as long
it's
for
still
us.
Within the context of it's like the civil rights movement of sorts. It's like, is it in our heads? Yes. Is it very strong in our yes. If it was somebody else from a country that didn't have that, would it be? No. I mean, we still have people who are talking about the Civil War now. I mean, so this is within some of these people's lifetime of going through that and living through it. And so, yeah, I would imagine it's strong, especially if you felt like you were subjugated and somebody was on top of you. Like, what did the revolutionaries feel like after the revolution with England in the United States, let's say 100 years out? What was their context? What were they thinking? You don't think that in their heads they were still in this notion of revolution and democracy and this is country and everything else? It just ended differently. It looked different. That's all. And so in this case, it looks different. I guess for me, I feel like John Luke Picard on a lot of this stuff. And seriously, I don't mean it in thing. It's like each country have their things that they fight over and things that they move. And if you leave them to their own devices, there will be this push towards individual liberty and freedom in regards to what they process that as. Because they're going to have this notion of fairness in and of themselves. And that is going to evolve and develop as they go along. I don't need to intrude. Now, if it's killing people, okay, then maybe I get more complicated. If it's,
I mean, if they're killing their own citizens,
right? Like if it's an active, like
But there's
what was it? The African Civil War, where the one was just massacring
the
large
Hutus and the
numbers.
Tutsis, the Rwandan genocide.
But that's an extreme case for me. Oftentimes, when it's a political situation, it's light touch, political pressure on some level, but light touch. And oftentimes, that's not what we do. We're not doing light touches. We are, hey, take this gun, go in here, start some trouble.
Yeah, totally.
It becomes that.
Yeah.
And I'm against that.
Because there's a gradient of acceptable behavior here, and you can easily slip beyond the gray zone into what's beyond the pale or whatever. You can get into the truly nasty stuff. And again, if it's Rwanda, that's one thing. If it's like random persecution of citizens by
like
cops
Venezuela,
occasionally,
I don't need to get involved.
Specifically, 100% agreed on Venezuela.
It's that stuff. Like,
but my point is, I guess my point
Nazis,
is, there's a lot of subtlety. You can't come up with hard rules for these things. What you have to rely on is individual judgment. Sadly, the like systems that would judge whether or not any given intervention is just are going to be co-opted, and they're probably going to support and
they've been manipulated.
They've either been co-opted or they can easily be overridden. In the vast majority of these cases, it seems. Which means, if we decide to go in and overthrow a country just because they're doing X, even though we should do it because they're doing Y, which is a lot worse than X, we'll do that, and it won't benefit them. And in the same way that there's a sliding scale of justification, there's also like a sliding scale of long-run intervention. There are ways that we could help other countries. Yeah. But if we go so far in this direction, if we just destroy it, if we do the Vietnam or really more timely and a bit more appropriate, the Iraq or the Afghanistan thing.
The wild part is that once you get something like the internet, once you get interconnectivity among other countries and everything else, and countries can see what other countries are doing, you almost don't even need those interventions. It's almost like Independence Day. In order to destroy Earth, the ship, and it was like, it's a quarter of the size of the moon. And it's like, so if you move the moon 25% closer to Earth or halfway closer to Earth, what would it happen to Earth? Well, Earth would be destroyed by that. But that's basically what they're saying. You're saying the size of the moon or a quarter of it has just moved like right beside Earth.
Yes, yeah.
Meaning you don't really need to get out the ship to destroy Earth. Just the ship itself and the mass of it would destroy. It's kind of like that. It's like you don't even really need to go that far into it.
Maybe, but isn't that just a sort of laissez-faire policy? Don't intervene ever, because there are cases, and this is the thing, there are cases for it.
Right.
But in the case of Rwanda, say Rwanda had Twitter.
Right.
Back in the 90s.
Right. And people would see it, and it would be horrifying, and people might get involved. I guess, right, that's an extreme case, so fair enough. But I guess I'm saying, let's say in not extreme cases, just the very pressure of other governments in the way that people can see what's happening in other countries creates this kind of slide to, I want to be more like that.
Maybe. And
I'm not saying that everything is like that.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's where I'm going with that. But I'm just saying because that's what's happening now on some level.
As far as I can tell, the Geneva Conventions should set us up for something like a principled stance on when we should intervene in other countries, but they don't seem to have very well. We seem to do whatever we want to, which means that a principled stance, even though it's impossible, seems impractical right now. It's just, we do what we want to, basically,
And we use that as a fig leaf. It's like saying, all right, we know that there are situations that, like if they're massacres or if they're Nazis, etc. And because we know that, we can use that as a pretense to basically get involved, even when it's not that.
And we can do that with Cuba if the protests get bad enough. In fact, Miami's mayor was talking about doing that, like we reported just yesterday. And
we tried to whack Castro hundreds of times. I mean, people need to realize that. Like, is exploding cigars one of those? That was one of the ones.
Exactly,
that one of the crazier, loonier ideas.
And we have him.
Oh, excellent.
We have been semi-rambling because we wanted to get into Cuba and we don't know enough about it. And so we've been talking around the issue with what we do know. But now we're joined by a Cuban history professor, Benita Albiza. Jamarl, you want to bring him in?
Benita, welcome to the show. Benita Albiza is a professor at the University of Havana and works as coordinator at Cuban Trails. Benita, how are you? Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So
when the people know the truth about Cuba.
Excellent. So let's go into that.
Let's speak a lot.
So let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us what happened just before the revolution? Let's say set us up several years before the Cuban Revolution took place.
All right. You have to understand the history of Cuba is always linked to the big power. First, we were linked to Spain. Spain was the first one who arrived to Cuba in 1492, and Christopher Columbus, he controlled Cuba. And then for more than 400 years, they controlled Cuba. In 1898, the United States involved in the war that Cuba and Spain was having. And of course, bigger army, bigger everything, they win the war. They took control of Cuba. For more than 60 years, from 1898 to 1959, they had control of Cuba. But not only political control, because we were an independent country. We have a republic, we have a president, we have a constitution. But they have full control of the Cuban economy and full control of our foreign trade. Every time we're going to have a new deal with some country, we have to ask permission to the United States. So they have full control of everything here. Also, the bourgeois, they have a big control of the Cuban economy. And the poor people were very poor. So in 1950s, right before the revolution started, we were a country that had a lot of rich because we were the sixth country, one to the sixth country that had more cars in all America.
Wait, say that again?
So in all America, we were the country with more cars, only after the United States. Also,
that little country Cuba had more cars than the U.S. back then?
But you're talking about on a person basis. For every Cuban, basically, that Cuban had more cars than your average American.
Per capita.
Right, per capita, not total numbers, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So
Interesting.
That was, you can understand how important was the Cuban economy. The Cuban peso in that time was the same as $1 American dollar in 1950s. So the Cuban economy was very high. But that was only for a small part of Cubans. Because more than 60% of the peasants, the people who work on the countryside, they were poor. They don't know how to read and write. They don't have.
Okay, wait. So I want to pause here for just a second, and I want to look back before we get into the revolution, because we've just gone briefly over the colonial history. Didn't even touch on the pre-colonial history, but we can leave that aside because that's a longer and arguably long enough ago that it's less relevant. But there's a colonial history. Then you have the Americans effectively coming in. What are the differences between the Spanish colonial reign and America's neocolonialism, its version of colonialism? What do those two reigns look like, and how do they compare to each other, Benito?
The first thing is that under Spain was ruling politics and everything here. When we were in neocolonials, they were like, we have a country, we have a government, we have a constitution, we have a president, we have all what a free country has. But the biggest difference was the control of the economy. In Spain, everything was Spain. But with the United States in the 20th century, we have like a big control of the United States, but also we have some freedom to trade with other parts of the country. But more of the 80% of the Cuban exports, that was mostly sugar, were to the United States. So we were only linked to the United States in economy and in politics. We were free, we were independent, but still we had like a lot of
economic dependence. And so just to try to sum it up, because I want to get to another side of the relationship with the U.S., but under American rule, quote unquote, Cuba had a lot more independence. It had, nominal political independence, and it had a lot more economic autonomy. In other words, deciding how to run their economy, run their industry. It wasn't just like you had a viceroy from Spain or from America, in this case, coming in telling them how to do everything. But nevertheless, they had these really important trade ties, namely their main export was Cuban sugar to America. In other words, they were deeply dependent on them, which leads, I want to look at this from the other side. From your opinion, looking at Cuban history, how do you view America's perspective of Cuba during this approximately 50-year period from, I believe you said it was 1898 to the revolution, this 50+ year period. How do you think America viewed Cuba? Because two things I want to bring in here that we already talked about a couple of minutes ago before you came on. One, during Prohibition, wasn't it the case that Americans would go to Cuba to drink because they had other laws there? Didn't we kind of view it as a tourist center? And then similarly, part of what led to the revolution, what's flavored how we viewed it since then, wasn't Cuba like a big center for organized crime, which fits in with Prohibition, of course, but you had a lot of American mafiosis, American organized crime groups operating out of Cuba. Am I wrong on anything there? And broadly, how do you think America viewed Cuba, Benito?
So that is on different stage. All the foreign policy to Latin America from the United States, they always apply it first here. For example, the policy from the United States to America Latina is for Latin America in the first years of the 20th century before the Second War was how we call here the big stick. That means that every time that a country doesn't do what they want, they apply the stick. It's the invasion to Haiti, it's the invasion to the Dominican Republic, it's the invasion to Nicaragua. They did that before in Cuba. So they always make a trail of how they're going to apply the policy to Latin America. They first apply it here. The second important big policy was the Roosevelt applied in 1930s. That was the good neighbor. The good neighbor, then they applied to Latin America in the 1930s, they applied it first here. How that was the good neighbor here? In 1920s and 1930s, the American ambassador that was like part of the government, he started to be less involved in Cuban decisions. That was the time in 1930s when Gerardo Machado was the president. And that made a revolution in 1930s here because the people knew that the American ambassador was not involved, but behind the scenes, he was continuing giving orders. And then in 1940s is when the mafia started to move here. The idea was simple. That started in 1930s. When the prohibition from the alcohol was applied there in the United States, Cuba became the place for buy the rum and smuggle it in the United States, and that made them a lot of money. Also, the Cuban rulers, the Cuban presidents, the Cuban politicians knew that was a business that made a lot of money. So they allowed that business. They allowed to them to establish here. They allowed them to make business here, and they allowed them to make here business. So in 1940s and in 1950s, the mafia ruled Cuba. They ruled Cuba because Batista, that was a strong man in Cuba, opened the doors to them. All the big hotels that they made, National Hotel, Riviera Hotel, Capri Hotel, Sevilla Hotel, all those was the big hotels in Havana in 1940s and in 1950s. They all were made with mafia money. And that was one of the things that stopped in the first day of 1959. When the revolution started, that was one of the first things that the revolution attacked because they ruled the country.
And this is going to come a bit later, but the sort of seedy organized crime ruling of Cuba in the post-revolutionary period, this is, again, we'll come back to this if we have time, but in the same way that Mexico City was a hub for international diplomacy between the intelligence communities of the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a kind of meeting grounds, like a sort of local Switzerland on the North American side, or the Central American side in the case of Mexico City. We would meet there. I believe we would do the same thing with Cuba occasionally. It had at least for a time, like a bit more of that air of neutrality about it. But one thing here, you described a lot of actions, both by Americans. You mentioned Batista and him letting outside influences come in, invest a lot of money, build up hotels owned, by American entities, that kind of thing. What did that do to the Cuban people? Setting us up for the revolution here. And I hear you coming in. Please feel free to correct anything I'm saying that's wrong there. How did the Cuban people feel about this? In other words, what was how do they feel, and how is the revolution sort of paved by these actions? How is it allowed to happen by everything that was leading up to it?
Well, the Cuban people, the Cuban people, they knew that that was wrong. And we have like big three moments of revolution before 1959, then shows that the Cuban people was not agree with that way to make politics. The first big moment is around 1930s, when Gerardo Machado, he was the president, and he abolished all the political parties, and he was like the only people, the only person who can do politics. And that made a huge revolution in 1933. That revolution was between 1933 to 1936. The second big moment was in 1952, when Batista, he made a coup and took the government for his own and put a dictatorship. And after that, different groups start to make like different ways of revolution.
I see.
It was Castro. And the other groups was all the small groups that start to do their own way to change politics. We have the people who were politics before, like Ramon Grau, Carlos Prio. Then he started to try to change through politics the person of Batista, and he doesn't accomplish nothing. We have another group that was the students, the Catholic students, and they try to change. But the only group they make.
Batista.
Sounds like we might have lost him.
Benito? Oh, we might have lost him. Oh, we're getting the Castro. Oh, you back? Can you?
No, he's still gone. We're getting him back.
Okay, getting him back. Yeah,
he's just getting. Yeah, okay.
We're trying.
Yeah, he was just getting into Castro.
He was just getting
into
Castro. It's like, I heard the name Castro.
The only group that was able to pull it off or something. It sounds like.
And it was the Castro, and I was like, all right, I'm waiting.
Now we're getting into it.
We're getting into it
because we'd set up that period, which is, if you want to know, okay, the emotional relevance of the revolution.
Right.
When Miguel Diaz-Canel is talking to people about, hey, get out on the street for the revolution. What does that mean? You got to set up. What does that mean to the people? What were they living through that the revolution took on such potency for them?
But the catch is, right? What are they living through?
We have them back on.
Excellent. Benito. Okay, good. We have you back.
Yes, so sorry. Yeah.
No, you're fine. Please continue. We were getting into the revolution, basically, that the other groups, you were naming the groups, weren't able to bring through the revolution, but you were making the point about Castro, or you're getting to Castro.
Fidel.
Yeah, Fidel.
Yes. The other groups, they cannot do nothing. The only way that Fidel understood, then the only way to change what was happening in 1950s in Cuba was through a revolution, but not a peaceful revolution, a war.
Right.
The only way to remove the mafia, remove Batista, and remove the American control of Cuba. So he understood that was the only way, so he applied that only way. And that's what he does. And he started in 1953, when José Martí, the national hero of Cuba, was 100 years. He applied a revolution.
Now, when you say he applied a revolution, what happened mechanically? What took place? Because Castro's understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that any change, there were no potential to change the political situation. That Batista at that point basically had full control of the island with the Americans backing. And as long as it was going to stay basically a sugar plantation or a gambling center, America was fine with it. But the Cuban people realized that in order to have some level of agency in their own country, they basically had to fight back and take it with a revolution. What did Castro do starting off? Meaning mechanically, take us through the steps of this.
So I give you the three groups that was against Batista, or you can understand that in the beginning, Fidel was just another group.
Oh, I see.
When he attacked in 1953 the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, the second garrison in Cuba, the first garrison was in Havana and the second garrison was there in Santiago. He attacked with one plan, attack that garrison, took the weapons, and go to the mountains to start a guerrilla war. Mm-hmm. But he don't have any military training. He has the people who fight with him. He doesn't have, no preparation. So that failed. Until that moment, he was another person trying to change. But 1953 to 1955, he were in prison with all the people who attacked the Moncada. And in prison, he understood then the only way to change was unify all the Cuban people who were against Batista, unify to fight together. So he founded the 26 July movement, and when he was released from the prison, he moved to Mexico and started to find allies. Politicians, Carlos Prio, you are against Batista? Yes, you can ally me to fight him. Students, José Antonio Echeverría, you want to fight Batista? Yes, we can fight together. So he made a big movement, and he came back in 1956 to start the revolution with a guerrilla fight. In that moment is when Che Guevara joined to him. In that moment is when Camilo Cienfuegos joined to him. And in that moment, when he went to the mountain Sierra Maestra in Oriente province, when he went there, he started to join peasants. He started to join people. He started to join young people to fight. Fran País Garcia is another important person. He was a young student. He was a Catholic student, but he understood that Fidel Castro was the person who can lead us to the victory against Batista. Another important person in that time of war is Raúl Castro, the brother of Fidel. Raúl Castro, like all family, the older brother tried to protect the younger brother. And Fidel always tried to protect his young brother. And how he protect him? He always put Raúl in a special task. For example, in 1958, he put Raúl in an area in the center of the mountains that was complete free. But the task he has was, you have to apply here the revolution. You have to apply here what we have in our plan. Our plan is an agrarian reform. Our plan is free education. Our plan is free health. Our plan is give the people dignity. So in 1958, Raúl Castro, in the second front, Segundo Frente, in the second front, he applied what the revolution wanted to do. And Raúl Castro was the person, then in 1958, in December, he attacked Santiago de Cuba, the second city in Cuba, and took Santiago de Cuba and started to apply the revolution there. So we have in the war different levels. The other level is Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos. They were moving to the center of the island to take control of the other half of the island, because the western part, where Havana is, has more soldiers and is where Batista were and is more protected. But the eastern part was more easy to take. And that's what Fidel thinks. We have to cut the island and start to apply the revolution, apply the agrarian reform, apply all these social politics. And that's what he put to his brother to do, and what he put to Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos to apply.
Now, when you say, okay, so apply the revolution, now what happens mechanically from the standpoint of they are at war, or they basically go to war with Batista and the current government structure? Now, what happens during that process? Meaning, how does Castro, A, win that war? Like you say, he starts off with basically no experience, no training in this, but he's able to bring people together. Now, he's able to bring people together because those people are basically against the government, like all of those disparate groups and all of those different political factions.
Here, first, I think the luck was very important, because they don't have any military experience, but they understood and they win the favor of the peasants in the mountains, and with the favor of them, they knew how they can hide and make a successful guerrilla war against the Batista soldiers. So they knew that that was his biggest strength, be hidden against the soldiers. Of course, the soldiers had more weapons. They were armed by the United States Army. So they were like more prepared. But the Cubans, the group of Fidel Castro, they had experience from the people on the mountains. Here we have another very important person, and it's called Che Guevara. Che Guevara also doesn't have any military experience, but he was a leader. And as a leader, he pushed the people to find a solution. He showed the way so the people can follow him. And he win experience because he started to read books from China, books from the Second War, books from the Russians, how to make a war. And he tried to apply that to the Cuban guerrilla. So the person of Che Guevara was the person who tried to organize and try to make the people understand how to do the war. The other person is Camilo Cienfuegos, another commander from the revolution. Camilo Cienfuegos was the most brave person in the entire world. There is a lot of crazy stories about him. Like one time, he was in the middle of the combat and a partner was wounded in one leg, so he cannot move. And in front of the enemy, he ran, take his friend, and run back. And the enemy, they was shocked. Then the person do that and doesn't make a shot. But they don't fire to him. They just were looking them. Him doing that and looking the other person. So that was the type of story that made the people feel
that's associated with him. Let me ask you this. From the standpoint of pushing and, I guess, going after the government, I would imagine, did any other groups support, I should say, Castro in this effort to overturn? Meaning, was it just the rebels themselves that were pushing back against the Batista government, or were there other groups that were assisting?
The year of 1958 is very important because the year of 1958 is when Fidel Castro started to send Che Guevara and Camilo to the center of the island. He sent Raúl to the Segundo Frente to make the revolution, to apply the revolution. But also, all the groups that were against Batista, they understood then they need a cut because they don't do nothing. They have not done nothing during the years of the war. But they understood then they need to be part of the people who win. And then in 1958, they tried to start to approach to Fidel. In 1958, in July 1958, a group goes to the El Escambray. Escambray is a mountain in the center of the island, and they try to make a guerrilla there. And it's when Fidel sent Che Guevara to that area and said, right, it's good that the people are fighting against Batista, but they have to recognize that we were fighting since 1956. We were fighting since 1953. So we were first. They cannot try to take what we have win for our war.
So this is when he's basically claiming power. He's saying, I'm in charge, basically.
Not me. The 26th July movement, then he was leading.
No, I guess what I'm asking is, it sounds like you're saying that among all of the other groups that were fighting, Castro is asserting at this point, look, we were fighting before, and this group is going to be the group that claims power over top of the island. We're going to be the governmental structure, basically.
Then in 1959, when he won the war, he was smart enough to join all those groups and say, all right, we were in the power, but we invite you to make revolution. But when the revolution started to apply, the more socialist or more social decisions is when those groups start to move away from the revolution. They start to say, no, I don't want that.
Now, what does that mean, move away from the revolution?
Sorry?
What does that mean? You said move away from the revolution. You said at the end of the war, when Fidel Castro, well, basically when they won the war, when you guys won the war, you said they tried to move away from revolution. What do you mean? Be specific when you say that. What does it mean to move away from the revolution?
The year of 1959 is a year with a lot of change. The first change is then Fidel and the group that were fighting, they took power. Batista left the country and they came to Havana and took power. Then when they took power, they started to make like a national government with all the groups that were against Batista they make a new government.
And one second, before you get there, what happens to the people? What happens when Batista leaves? Where does he go? And what happens to the people who lose the war?
That's a funny story because in the first days of 1959, the Cuban government, the new revolutionary government, they applied like judgments. I don't know how to say in English, like a trial. They applied trials to all the war criminals. The people.
Oh, trials. Okay, tribunals or trials, right?
The people who made torture, the people who were like criminal wars, they made to them trials, and of course, there was summer trials, and some of them were shot and killed because that was what the trial decided. But that was only in the beginning of the year of 1959. After that, that is when this is funny. When I was part of the military service, I was working with an officer that was a very young boy in 1959. But as a young boy, he were in the same battle with Che Guevara. He was fighting with Che Guevara in the war. And he always makes this story. Then one day he was in the park drinking beer with some friends, and he heard a person who was making stories about the Battle of Santa Clara, the battle where he was fighting with Che Guevara. And he approached him, and he said, well, I was walking in Santa Clara, and I was doing this, I was doing this, I was in this building. And he asked, hello, who were you fighting? Because I was in Santa Clara, and I don't remember that when you are explaining. He said, no. I was part of the Batista's army. I am explaining what Batista's army was doing. I was not part of the revolutionary.
And just to be clear, Batista had a secret police that ended up killing 20,000 people?
Yes. But there were people fighting in Batista's army that when the revolution started, they was staying living in Cuba because a lot of the people that was part of the army and part of this secret police, they ran away of the country in 1959, and they ran away with a big part of the Cuban money that Cuba had. The National Bank, for example, the Minister of Education, in January 1st, 1959, he went with his personal car to the National Bank, stopped in the National Bank and said, give me all the budget from the education minister for the next year, for all 1959. They cut the budget, put it in the car, and left the country. So they steal the country in the first days of 1959. But
I don't.
On the country with more than $100 million.
Yes, I can see how. Well, I can see how they can take the money, but at a certain point, you can't. It's not like they can steal the factories. It's not like they can steal the industry. But that doesn't mean that they wouldn't have tried. It's weird. You're describing him stealing a budget, right? That's
Yes.
What does that do? I guess I don't want to get caught up on that. But that specifically, it's an interesting situation. But the broader point that you're making is, after the war, a lot of people fled. A lot of the wealthier supporters of Batista fled. Some of the higher officials were held on, war crimes and other serious charges. But a lot of the supporters, a lot of the rank and file, a lot of the members of the army fighting for Batista, continued to live in Cuba and live mostly normal lives. That seems to be the legacy. Now that sets us up pretty well, I would say, for this point. And again, I know that you were wanting to steer away from modern politics, but even in the realm of history, the revolution that you're talking about, these are like the grandparents of the current Cuban adult generation, that kind of thing. This is in living memory for a lot of people. And if anything, it's, this 60, 70 years, they could blunt it, or it could give it the legitimacy of a legacy where your grandparents established this country and you need to fight to maintain it, that kind of thing. So when Miguel Diaz-Canel is calling for people to get out on the streets and fight for the revolution, does that symbol still have weight? What does that feel like? And is that poignant or evocative or powerful in getting people to act on it, the call for the revolution?
So defending revolution today means for the Cubans defend all what people have fight, all what people fight to get what we have. So we don't have the biggest economy in the world. We don't have like all the material wealth that the people want, but we had dignity, and we have for a fight then our grandfathers they made. We had part of that life. We had like the way that we can be independent. But
exactly. That's what I'm saying, is that it has that weight behind it. We've got to close it here. It was good talking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Benito Albiza, professor at Universidad de La Habana, works at coordinator at Cuban Trails. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with headlines in a minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across the disunited states of America and the increasingly divided, embattled, and fragmenting surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
The eternal, and together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The indefatigable, the essential, the immortal. Let's get into the headlines here, folks. I'm just rambling. Let's talk COVID news. First up, there are about 32,105 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. There were also about 258 new deaths. A lot of new cases in one day, and that, I'm sure, has contributed to the average of about 23,025 cases per day that we're suffering from right now. It's aggregated over the period of the last week, and it's 94% higher than the average 2 weeks before. This reminds you of the worst stages of the pandemic, like last March, April, when it was first starting out. And it's like, it's doubling every couple of days. This is exponential. That's not how the math is supposed to go if good things happen. Not a good situation back then. And that was before vaccines. We have vaccines now. It's happening again. I don't know why. I can only speculate, and hopefully we can get somebody on who can do more than just speculate soon, because right now it's what's left to us is holidays. Maybe 4th of July contributed to it. That's one. Yeah. Maybe lowered rates of people going out and getting vaccines. That I don't see exactly how that would make it worse, but it certainly wouldn't make it consistently better. So that might be 2. And then 3, variants? Well, question mark.
It also could be that when vaccines first came out, people rushed to get the vaccines.
Yeah.
And in some cases, you would make it like a drop in the numbers, et cetera, over time, and you drop. And then the dropping levels off. What the catch becomes, why is it dropping and leveling off? And I think the catch becomes, is it just because people have reached that, all right, you've reached this kind of default position of vaccinations?
The number of people who are going to get vaccines have got them, and the rest haven't, and here we are.
And so it's like, okay, now the number is just kind of bobbling back up.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. We'll see. I would love to get somebody on to talk about it. I guess maybe a doctor. Oh, not even a doctor. That's a different conversation.
I don't know. Yeah. Well, one really brief... I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
I'll do my best to come back to it. We got more headlines to get through. Yeah. Let's get through them. The FDA has issued a new warning to the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. In over 12 million doses administered, 100 individuals were reported as developing Guillain-Barré syndrome. This neurological disorder can cause numbness in the extremities and, in rare cases, full body paralysis. Of the 100 who developed Guillain-Barré, most were men over the age of 50 who received the shot 2 weeks prior. In national news, over 50 House Democrats in Texas left the state. They flew out of the state. Fled is a little bit more ambiguous. They left the state in an effort to block GOP legislation that has been labeled as voter suppression. The proposed bill would ban drive-through and 24-hour voting, make mail-in voting more difficult, and give partisan poll watchers more authority at voting sites. The move will temporarily bring Texan legislation to a halt, as the state's House of Representatives requires a 2/3 majority of the 150 seats to be present before beginning a vote. Again, more than 50 left, therefore they can't hold any votes. right now. This move by the Democrats is also illegal under Texas law, although the applicable jurisdiction is only Texas, so D.C. police won't be arresting them for this. President Biden is going to Philadelphia today to give speeches against voting law changes in Republican-led states and or against voter suppression laws. He is expected to criticize Trump, specifically Trump's ongoing efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. In international news, the French Competition Authority has fined Google $600 million for failing to negotiate in good faith with media outlets who are apparently due remuneration under a copyright law that France has signed onto, an EU law, and Google failed to give that remuneration. The Taliban has requested that Turkey leave the Kabul air base, a facility which was left behind by the United States and has been both protected and used by the Turkish government, agreed to by the U.S. last week. Turkey has more than 500 soldiers in Afghanistan right now, and the Taliban has said it would consider any foreign troops on Afghan soil after the withdrawal of NATO as invaders. So they would consider Turkey as invaders if nothing else changes and time rolls on. The International Olympic Committee president said that Tokyo was the best prepared host city ever for the Games, saying this was remarkable considering how seriously the coronavirus has disrupted things. I don't think it is racist, actually, to say that there's something not that surprising about the Japanese being very efficient at getting the Olympic Games run. Simply because it has nothing to do with the Japanese as an ethnicity or anything like that. It has to do with like a
cultural tradition,
national culture of industrial efficiency that seems to have been ingrained over the last 50 years. But, ethnic states, which is the modern version of states, it's a little bit weird to talk about without getting into race.
Yes.
And what is racism exactly? Anyway, the International Olympic Committee said this. Tokyo has apparently been doing a very good job. This, despite the fact that they're keeping outside protesters, it seems, from coming in as they've declared a state of emergency with coronavirus circulating.
Because they're not going to have anybody in the audience, if I'm not mistaken. Like they're doing the.
Well, no, it seems like they're going to have some local spectators, but they're not allowing international spectators to come in.
Okay.
And hopefully they'll have like cameras there and stuff,
Yeah.
So we can watch them. Of course, we'll be watching it at home. China's military drove away an American warship that it says illegally entered waters near the Paracel Islands yesterday. This comes on the anniversary of an international court ruling called the Arbitral Tribunal ruling by the UN. That ruling was on the extent of actions that can be taken by China, either talking about the PRC or Taiwan. A lawsuit brought by the Philippines. Both Taiwan and China have rejected that ruling, by the way. South Africa's defense minister has said for now there's no reason to declare a state of emergency as riots continue following the jailing of former South African President Jacob Zuma. Funerals have been taking place in Iraq for the victims of a fire that swept through the coronavirus ward of a hospital, killing more than 60 people there. Spain's equality minister has asked prosecutors to consider charging the country's most popular TikTok star on sexual offenses after the internet celebrity fessed up to duping women on whether or not he wore a condom. My guess is that he said that he wore a condom and he didn't. That's usually how that goes.
Yeah.
Usually people are not as pissed about the reverse.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I mean, I don't know, man. I don't know why they feel so gross. I guess you're having sex, but it's like the thin film is the difference between the two things.
That is the nature of a condom.
Yeah. I guess it's the betrayal of it all. More than anything else. I don't know. There's something massively creepy about that.
You're lying to somebody, and I guess for some kind of men, they're just like, I don't want to get somebody pregnant. I don't want the commitment, and so even that might be enough. But no, there's also just the dishonesty.
It's just the great betrayal of it all at some level. I don't want to do this to you. I'm grossed out by that, so I kind of want to use a gun. And
if you're lying to them, of course.
Well, right. But it's also you're trusting the person in this level of, I don't know if the person has the disease and everything else.
Yeah.
And it's a betrayal. And if they'll betray you in that way, it's just, I don't know. It bugs me. Me.
I'm going to say something very controversial and news-y here, which is
go for it.
I prefer not using
lying like that.
no,
right. That's not controversial.
Exactly. I'm just going to back up. I'm just kidding.
That's not controversial.
I'm being ironic.
That's just normal for men.
I'm being ironic. Let's get on to the other side of the headline so we can get away from this as fast as possible. It's a hit and run tomorrow.
No,
Those are headlines.
Let's talk about this that much more further.
Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Why do you have to go there? But it feels like the kind of thing that must be said as a man as the host of a talk radio show where we verge sometimes between the political, sometimes between the irrelevant. I don't know. Sometimes we just talk.
Well, I mean, I think I don't think that's controversial.
Of
I think
course not.
it's
No, of
men,
course-
you know,
of course not.
they just say that in general. No, I think the thing that creeps me out about it, the thing that immediately comes to mind, and maybe this is where the feeling comes in of so
You're
creepy.
lying. You're betraying somebody, effectively.
It's that, but I have a friend of mine that most of my friends were women as I was growing up, like, you know, and one of them, she made the point about a guy who got very mad at her because the condom came off, and the condom broke, and he was like, "It's your fault."
Wait, how's that work?
Well, he said it was her fault, and she's naive, and she's like, "Oh my God, maybe I did something wrong," and she accepts that, right? So it's like this stuff that men do sometimes annoy me to no end, and I guess that's, to me, it falls into kind of this kind of category of those events and just weirdness associated with sex. But no, that annoys me. The fact that he lied about it is just horrendous.
And then he's bragging about it on TikTok.
How do you do that?
That's pretty bad.
How do you do that?
That's a pretty sleazy move.
I mean, and
on
how do you go
multiple
on
counts.
TikTok and then brag about something? Like, does she watch you on TikTok? Meaning you're basically bragging about it after the fact that, haha, this is what I did to you.
It's a shame that this is the most popular Spanish celebrity on TikTok. It's not. It's like a national disgrace. That level of.
What does it say about?
What does it say about? I would say about humanity.
TikTok.
Yeah,
You know,
or TikTok.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
I wasn't talking about Spain. I was talking about what does it say
Exactly.
about our culture in general? Because that's not special to Spain. I mean, that could be here in the U.S. Like when you're traveling, what you find is on television, it's the same show, just in a different context. So you would have, like, in the mornings, you would have your dating shows. If you were in, like, Poland, you would have your dating or your court shows where it's like divorce court.
Yeah.
And they would just be Polish. And they'd be
Yes.
arguing with each other and everything else. You're like, God, man, it's the same thing that they recycle from one place to the next. So it's not just like, oh, this is only a Spanish thing. No, that's a world culture thing. And maybe on some levels a human thing. I tend to think human beings kind of go in the direction of incentives, kind of where you poke them to go. And yeah, it may get more luxurious and bigger. But were there like little tribesmen at some point in human past where they would be watching these two people fight and they were like, oh, that's interesting. And then later on it becomes something, well, hey, we could charge for this. And then later on you get divorce court. You know what I mean? Like, I'm pretty sure that those kernels were in human culture or society or somewhere at some point to get to the point where it is.
Are you saying that the natural ancestor of divorce court is the Roman gladiator, Jamarl?
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe.
On some level, the circus, it may be a different type of circus. But I'm just saying that TikTok star, it has to be in a somewhere where it's like you can incentivize that or something else. But that it's in some level either entertaining, and that entertainment is either disgust or that entertainment is applause. Meaning, because on some level, we're talking about this guy in a certain level of disgust. But isn't disgust on some level entertainment?
I don't know, but yeah, disgust, entertainment, shock, that kind of
Yeah.
galvanizing energy, doesn't that define a lot of comedy? And that isn't,
Yeah.
that's what this dude is doing. Now, arguably, at the same time, he's probably being honest. I don't doubt. A lot of dudes do that.
Yeah, a lot of guys
From
do that.
what I hear,
Right.
you know.
That's what I'm not shocked by. He's doing.
Yeah.
That's why it's not like, oh God, I can't believe he's lying. There's a guy that's doing that.
Exactly.
There's a guy that's doing that.
Yeah.
So yeah, man, that's really strange, outrageous, and if they can prosecute him, I hope they do. This kind of is like the Chris Brown story, where Chris Brown has such a record and a context where it's like if a dog bit somebody and you name the dog Hades and you are Chris Brown, I'm going to think that, well, Chris Brown probably trained that dog to be that way, meaning you loaded that dog. If I'm a prosecutor, Chris Brown goes to jail. Because my first thought is, all right, did you train the dog to be that way? Did you know the dog was that way? Did you leave the dog off the leash? And then I would say in my head, only in my head, Chris Brown has a history of beating women and flipping out. It is possible that Chris Brown trained this dog to be tough because he didn't want a cuddly couch dog like I do.
You were talking about an ongoing story right now where in the last week, Chris
Yes.
Brown has apparently had a dog mauling a housekeeper.
His housekeeper.
I thought of Michael Vick. A friend growing up, Chris, his family had a couple of, what are they, pit bulls?
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
Of Michael Vick's, that they had adopted.
Oh, really?
And trained to be the sweetest, most loving
Yeah.
dogs ever. But that's a true segue. It's a
That's
segue
amazing.
of a segue. But
I mean,
yes.
yeah, my dog is, sweet as can be.
Yeah.
And so it's like I think of that in my head when I think of those dogs. Because when we went to SBCA, we were going to get a dog. And the overwhelming majority of the dogs that were there in the Richmond SBCA were pits.
Yeah.
And it's because people would get them and they think, oh, it's cool. It's a status symbol. And then they find out, oh, wait, this is a real animal.
Yeah.
And this animal needs attention.
Yeah.
And this animal needs food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they take the animal back.
When you ignore that, that is the most disgusting thing to me.
It's horrible.
It gets me
because it's like
angry.
the dog can't tell you that it's in pain. That's the thing.
It can. You just are not listening.
Yeah, they're just not listening. Meaning, well, right, it whimpers and everything else, but the dog, it can't, like, if it's ill, if it's sick or something like that. And it's one of the most loving things, especially pit bulls.
Yeah,
so
well, they're born to love us.
Yeah, they're so loving.
That's people say I love pets, and then you're like, well, you look, or people say I love animals, and then you look at the list of animals they love, and it's like, okay, cats, dogs, what else? Guinea pigs. Those are all domesticated animals. They were literally bred to love us and to show us affection, to shower us. Cats may be an exception. I love cats and dogs, but the point is, it's like the easiest possible. It's like the dessert in terms of food of animals you're having to deal with, because it's been bred to be the sweetest, most saccharine thing for you to deal with possible. And what we would do is we choose ones that are cute or otherwise appealing to us, and then we mistreat them because we don't understand them. We never choose to understand them. We treat them with an absolute lack of respect, which is why this is getting personal for me. But if I have a pet, I want to do it on a farm where that animal is going to be working alongside me. I'm going to be working alongside it, and I'm going to helplessly respect it, because then I'm going to see it as a kind of equal. You're going to be colleagues. You're going to be, and you have to understand them. You got to. Anyway, you caught me on a thing I care a lot about, Jamarl.
And I like that. I like the idea behind that. I mean, because basically we're forcing the animal in our own domain and everything else, as opposed to in a farm. I guess you can say the same thing, but all of you are working to the same ends, even if the animal doesn't entirely understand
it's symbiotic, and there's mutual dependence, not just dependence, and not codependence.
It's like you're drinking the cow's milk. It's like you're sucking on the udder.
Oh yeah.
You're eating the eggs. It's like you're sucking on whatever the eggs are coming
You're
out.
sucking on the cloaca.
Right.
What are you saying there,
Jamarl?
Jamarl?
All of the right there, all of you together. No, I know what you mean. The dog thing is a little bit different, because the relationship that you're getting is like an empathy of sorts.
Yeah.
Like I've often asked myself, like my wife, why do you want kids? And she's like, what do you mean, why do I want kids? And it's like, what do you get out of it? And I think having the dog, I kind of see it. It's like there's something that you get out of that relationship. This notion of taking care of something else, making something else happy, even if they don't entirely get it, that I don't quite.
Their love and setting aside your own interest for somebody else, and keeping another being's needs and wants in mind. That whole thing that prepares you for deeper relationship.
Yeah, there's something about it that is rewarding. I can see the thing with the animal.
And arguably people, whether you're a man or you're a woman, and probably there are differences in how we respond, but like we respond to having kids. But if you're a woman, very certainly it has exited your birth canal. You had the kid, you're going to change because of that. But people talk about how husbands or fathers or whatever, just people, whether, you adapt to having kids. You become a different person. You have to take care of this other thing. And there's a weird, like, obviously intimacy with that. But with pets, coming back to that in closing before we go into our break and come back with Peter Oliver, I remember having conversations when I was traveling in Europe, and it got brought to mind recently talking with Mark Frost, frequent guest on the show, who lost his cat, you may remember. We were talking with him about it around that time. And we were talking about the loneliness and the sadness and how close you get to animals. And I remember this time I was in England, this guy I was staying with through couch surfing, he was describing how he just lost a cat, and it stuck with me. These animals, these pets, you're closer to them than you are to almost any person, arguably to any person. They're with you constantly. You talk to them. Well, they never talk back. They kind of always are. You're always in a kind of communication with them if you're paying attention to them, and you're with them together constantly. You feel like they get you. You're intimate with them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You have that feeling of closeness for years and years and years and years, and then all of a sudden they're gone. And unless you've lost a spouse, somebody in that role, I hear it's hard to compare.
It's painful. Losing a pet is painful.
Yeah.
I mean, when Bo died, because Bo died, his stomach had exploded. He had all of this, like, just stuff that went on. At one point, he had cancer. He had, like, all of this stuff happened within the course of that year. I think he had cancer at one point. We got him recovered from the cancer. And then after that, we ended up getting sick again. He was sick for a while. We were trying to forcibly feed him, because usually Bo is the dog that would eat anything. He would eat anything. And so it's like the fact that he wasn't eating was shocking to us. Yeah, man, it's very extremely painful. My wife, she lost her dog. And at that time, I entirely didn't know her. I mean, she had raised the dog and everything else, but I didn't necessarily know Queen in the same way.
Yeah.
Bo, yes. Bo, I had Bo for years. And Bo had basically grew up with Pitsu, who was a puppy at the same time, and just kind of grew up together.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's tough. It's rough. I mean, honestly, I know this sounds rough, but when I set placement in regards to pain from death, that is probably higher than most any other in my life, despite most any other being people. Only because, like you say, you're around them constantly. It's not that he is more value. It's not that. It's that you were with him for so many years that it leaves this kind of weird hole in the space that he typically is. It's almost like the whole takes up space in and of itself.
Yeah.
It's like the absence is a thing into itself. It's very strange. It's very weird. It's rough. It's painful. Very painful. And it sets your context when you're thinking of stories like this. It makes you more hostile to the story because it's like you get the context of the death in that sense. And it's kind of weight and gravity to it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's close this out. We segued onto another segue there a couple of times, and we talked about dogs for a little bit. We're going into a break, coming back with Peter Oliver on the other side. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you guys are interested in joining the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and a call at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So we've been having this conversation about the changing of the guard that is taking place in Germany, with Angela Merkel basically leaving at the end of the year, and this question of what happens. Now, at one point, the thought was that the Green Party had gained a certain level of prominence and a certain level of strength, and that this was going to end up with a coalition where the Greens were going to be able to gain some sway. This, of course, could have had repercussions for Nord Stream 2 and the pipeline, but it seems like that the pipeline is going to be built, and it also seems like the Greens are going to have a difficult time taking that particular control of that particular power in the way that we thought. It seems that the Greens and their political ambitions might have went up in gas. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Peter Oliver. Peter Oliver is EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from sources from across the European Union. And I could hear the collective people out there laughing at gas instead of smoke. Peter, how's it going, Peter?
Yeah. It's going really well, guys. That little segment you did just before prompted me to run across the house and grab Zappa, the little West Highland White Terrier that's my little pal, and give him a little stroke just now. But yeah, we're not going to get onto that. We're going to stay on that. We'll be talking about gas, Angela Merkel, Nord Stream 2, and the Green Party. It's not looking all that great.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was getting at. So what has happened to the Green Party, their political ambitions? Beforehand, when you were here, you were making a point that the political ambitions of the Greens were looking good. But now, these days, apparently not so much. What's happened?
Well, we're currently looking, the very latest polling I've got in front of me puts the Conservatives, the centre-right of the Christian Democratic Union, the Christian Social Union on 28%. They were level pegging with the Greens for a long time now. Both the Greens and the Social Democrats, who are the current coalition partners, are both on 17%. So they're a long way back. If, say, either the Christian Democratic Union, Social Union were able to pick up a few more points, and maybe the Social Democrats were able to pick up a few more points as well, Well, the Green Party could end up not being in power at all. As it stands, it does look like they will still play a role in the next government. They may. What role that will be, well, it's getting less and less as their numbers drop down and down. Germany's always governed by a coalition. It's incredibly rare that one party wins the over 50% of the Bundestag that's needed in order to have a mandate in that parliament. So it's going to be the makeup of that coalition. It's going to be probably the most interesting thing to come out of this election that will be held in September. We are really looking at a continuation of a CDU-CSU chancellor. It will most likely be Armin Laschet, the leader, the governor, really, in American sense, of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia over in the west of Germany. The big things that have come for the Greens have been, well, in relation to Annalena Baerbock, their candidate for Chancellor, Annalena Baerbock, I beg your pardon. There was initially one scandal, if you're willing to accept it as a scandal, that she'd padded her resume somewhat, that she'd said that she held positions that she either hadn't held or positions that didn't exist as positions. There was then, and this is a quite common scandal for German politicians, accusations that she had plagiarized some of her writings in one of her books and also in her PhD. Surprising number of politicians in Germany hold doctorates in one field or another. There's always some kind of accusation that somebody's doctorate had been plagiarized. Baerbock was the latest for that. What the Greens did just this week, in fact, what they did yesterday on Monday, was they launched their election campaign, and they're going to try and go a little bit more attacking. What they have to try and do is to get that market of the 60-plus age group, because they are not doing well there. As you would imagine, the Green Party has the environment very heavily at its centre. In order to fund a lot of the proposals that they've put forward, it would either increase taxes upon those people that fall into that either retired or just about to retire bracket, or would harm potentially things that they have their pensions invested in. Now, the one of the big ones that's come out here is about putting a speed limit on the Autobahn, of all things. And the Green Party have said they're very much in favour of doing that if they were to do that, they could save 5% of carbon emissions if they were to put a speed limit there.
It's sacrilegious.
The Autobahn's quite close.
It's deeply sad.
Yeah.
Even as an American, I'm sorry for cutting in there, Peter, but Jamarl was too. That is deeply sad. Even from the American perspective, that's a uniquely German thing that it seems. I don't drive right now. I walk and bike. But if I were to go to Germany, drive around there, the Autobahn, that's like an international draw. Driving as fast as you want on well-maintained roads sounds beautiful. It's a joke almost, and it is sacrilegious. But how's that being received by the German public, Peter?
50-50. You say well-maintained road. I've driven in the United States. I can say that they're certainly well-maintained by the standards of the highways there that I've driven on. By the standards of places like the Netherlands, even bits of France, even Italy, not so much Denmark as well. There's a feeling that the infrastructure needs upgrading, that that cutting the speed limit would, as I said, they reckon 5% of carbon emissions from the roads would be cut. And the idea that the Autobahn is, you pull onto the freeway and you can go as fast as you want wherever you want, that's not really been the case for a while now. It's only in certain stretches that are particularly straight for a particularly long time that you are allowed to do it. So it's been jumped on by the Greens, as you would imagine. It's also become a policy for the Social Democrats as well. So whoever helps form a government alongside the centre-right party, they're probably going to have to deal with some calls for a speed limit on the Autobahn. But it's funny, I'm actually going to be doing a story on this for RT during this week. We're putting together a package where I'm going to trying to convince a certain German car brand to let me drive one of their sports cars incredibly fast around the Autobahn.
That's
which should be very fun.
Peter, this is horrible. horrible story. I hate that.
Well, I read an interesting comment. I don't usually like to look at the comment sections, but there was one comment from a guy in the UK on this story, and he said, "Oh, this is terrible. If you can't drive as fast as you want in Germany, you may not be able to smoke marijuana in the Netherlands.
That's exactly where I was going.
To drink wine in France."
That's exactly where I was going. It is like Shane said, it's uniquely German. It is a thing. It's like if I am at home and I'm like, man, I want to go to Amsterdam because I want to smoke pot. If I want to go to Germany, I want to do the Autobahn. It's just something that's there. It's like watching sumo wrestling in Japan.
I think as like a 10-year-old kid, before I knew the exact geographical location of Germany, I was aware that Germans could drive really fast.
Yeah.
And that was cool to me.
That's what I mean. It's like you're cutting off the nose of the Sphinx.
Exactly.
It's so intense that you're doing that. That's amazing.
Well, that they're maybe doing
that. I hope that doesn't come to pass. That's all. So let's do this. Let's take a break, and I'm going to bring you back, and I want to get into the EU army. This was something that I remember Nigel Farage used to complain about, yell about, big time when he was back in the European Parliament. And this notion that, it's like, what is the point of the European Union? And is it a financial union, or is it this kind of, let's say, larger governmental structure? And it seems to be the latter. But when people initially got into it, they got into it for it to be a financial union. Now these guys are talking about military. So let's take you off for a break. The voice that you guys are listening to is Peter Oliver. Peter Oliver is EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we continue to be joined by Peter Oliver. He is the EU correspondent for RT International, and he provides daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Follow him on Twitter at PeterGOliver_RT, and catch his reporting weekly on RT International. Peter, we're going to get to natural gas. I just want to stay with this for just a minute, just sticking with the Greens in Germany. It's and of course, they're related. Because we're going to see later this year exactly what happens on a number of grounds. But just sticking with the Greens for a minute. I want to pass it back to you with a question and then a sort of point of clarification. One, a point of clarification. You gave some numbers earlier, specifically the most recent polling. I just would ask you, can you just briefly give us what's the before and after? If we were to go to the moment of the most apparent triumph of the Greens, looking forward to the September election, how well were they doing when they were transcendent, and compared to that, how poorly are they doing now? How has the polling changed? Just to get the numbers out there.
24% on the 3rd of May of this year. And yeah, so 24%, that seems to have been the highest they got to. Incidentally, that wouldn't have given them enough because the CDU-CSU were also on 24% at that time. They would have had to bring in another party into a coalition in order to get past 50%. But yeah, the Greens were on 24% on the 3rd of May. They are now on 17%.
So two months later, and that is a big That shift is that's a big shift. Not to be understated, and to be clear here, even though that's a minority for an American audience, it's like, okay, if Biden or Trump are only getting 30%, you're thinking they're doing pretty poorly. This is, of course, a different type of system, parliamentary system. We're talking about the Bundestag, where you need to form coalitions in order to govern. That's the context in which we're having this conversation, just for other audiences. Anyway, those are the numbers. That is pretty stark, and that's just 2 months ago. That was a fast shift. Have we? I just want to be clear. Have we laid everything out on the table? Annalena Baerbock, the charges against her seem to be largely superficial, at least from the way that you were describing them. It seems like what would get people's hearts and minds out and changing is a conversation probably about taxes and maybe something about the Bundestag, like you were saying, like these more economic and sort of nationalistic even, although that has other connotations, but I think you get my point. These more local cultural conversations. Is there anything else that's not being brought up? Because just those two don't seem like they would be enough to cause such a significant shift, a big shift in the popularity of the Greens. Is there anything else, Peter, before we move on?
Well, you've got to remember the Greens here in Germany are also quite similarly a centrist party, really a centre-right party, where they draw a lot of their power base from the incredibly wealthy state of Baden-Württemberg in the southwest of Germany. There, they are pretty much a centre-right party. I think I've cracked the joke on your show before that they're basically the CDU, just they really dig on recycling a lot more. And that has, initially they were the new kids on the block a little bit. They were the big change. Then people have looked at what policies they've been offering and thought, well, I get the same with the CDU, and there's less likely chance they're going to take my car away. And that is, Germans like, certainly from their politics, they like things to be calm. They like the status quo. It's and that's where we're seemingly heading. I think what we may well end up seeing is when Angela Merkel hands over the baton to Armin Laschet, it will be, yes, a new chef, but the same recipes that are being cooked. And that's one of the reasons why I am fully convinced, certainly with the news that we've had regarding things like Nord Stream 2. Just today, just yesterday, I beg your pardon, the main guy behind that, the executive director, said it's 98% finished. It's going to be finished next month, the construction phase. 3 months after that, it'll start working. Now, the Greens vehemently opposed to Nord Stream 2. That doesn't really stack up when it comes to what Germany needs, because Germany needs the gas, and the gas that Germany needs is the gas that Germany needs is the gas that comes at the price of which Russia is willing to sell to it using Nord Stream 2. And
it will have been done. The pipeline will have been completed by the time of the September election. You said next month.
It'll be going through a period, according to, according to Matthias Vanig, who's the executive director. They'll be getting their certificates and carrying out safety checks by the time the election's going on. Annalena Baerbock gave a big interview to the Atlantic Council in which she pretty much said, I'll do whatever Joe Biden does. Whatever Joe's having, I'm having. And it didn't go down too badly, but it also didn't go down brilliantly with a lot of people. She wasn't going to win any new voters for the Green Party by saying that.
Yeah, and it's because it seems like the German public, I want to come back to, or I want to pivot to natural gas here, because I feel like you have actually given a pretty good explanation. But the German public, not just wanting to go along with whatever the United States says at this point. And Nord Stream 2 is itself an example of exactly that. But you explained it. It's not so much that there was a big crisis that the Greens went through, which we would be more familiar with in American politics. It's more that they were the new kids on the block for a time. They lost some of that new popularity they might have had, the novelty. And they've done and said some slightly less than popular things. And therefore, it's just been this rather quick shift out of being the front runners, effectively, like the surprise front runner. Anyway, we can get into natural gas. I'm done for that.
Yeah, somebody basically licking different lollipops and saying, "Oh, I like this lollipop right now," and moving to the next one in the box. We had something like that here with the primaries and the Democratic primaries, where the media would go to like Clinton, Hillary for a while, Elizabeth Warren for a while. Then we'll go to somebody else for a while, then somebody else for a while, et cetera, et cetera. Let's go to, before we get to the EU Army or the attempts at the EU Army, let's go to natural gas for a bit. So is Russia putting on the brakes for gas in Europe just to, I don't know, make Europe feel the stranglehold? Or is Europe just guzzling a lot of gas right now? Because reading some of the publications out of Germany, the argument is that Russia is stranglehold on right here. Can Europe escape Gazprom's energy stranglehold? So what's going on? Explain to us this situation here. Germany is basically accusing Russia of what? Putting on the brakes in the gas that is being delivered, as opposed to them just using a lot of it.
Certainly not Germany as the government, in terms of the government that are accusing that. But if you would be
media.
mistaken,
I just
if you
mean
read
media.
a lot of the opinion pieces, if you read a lot of the opinion pieces in the German press, you would think that that's exactly what's happening. The facts of the matter is Russia has exported a huge amount of gas to Europe in the first half of 2021. They've, in fact, Gazprom's statistics show that they've had a 25.7% increase on last year. In fact, it's only the second largest. It's the second largest amount of gas they've ever exported in the first half of a year. 2018 was the largest. Germany's demand for Russian gas, well, it's gone up 43.4%. And the reasons for this has been, getting back to work, opening up somewhat after the pandemic, but then also an incredibly cold winter that went on for a long time, followed by essentially a heat wave that started in the middle of May and has continued on. I can't really do Fahrenheit when it comes to temperatures, but we've been in the 30s for quite a while in Berlin, which is not a city which is designed for that type of heat. So we've seen heating being on during the winter at much higher rates for much longer times. Now we've seen air conditioning even coming in and using up a lot more gas as well, a lot more energy as well.
So that's basically driving up the price.
Coincides with the fact that Germany is getting rid of its nuclear energy. The last nuclear plant will close down next year. The last coal plant will close down in 2038. In order to take up the slack, it's gas, and that's the way they're going forward with it. The concerns for Germany is that some people have said they haven't received what they were supposed to receive, that the supplies are low. Well, Gazprom says they've fulfilled the contracts as they were supposed to fulfill them, just usage has been higher. This all, of course, coincides with some planned maintenance that's coming up to the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which is the current existing pipeline that goes under the Baltic Sea, and the Jamarl pipeline that goes across Belarus and Poland, which will both be closed from this week until the 23rd of July. That's got people a little concerned.
Prices.
Supplies in countries like Germany and Austria, who have both reported that supplies are a little low. Going to be
and just
a
so we're
lot of
clear,
talk about gas pipelines.
And just so we're clear, that means prices are going to go up. Meaning prices
are already at a high at the moment.
So that's on some level, meaning the supplies and everything else, they require energy. And I'm saying this from my own personal experience of being in Germany and Czech Republic and some of these other countries that are over there. The energy is an issue. Like, it is so cold. And because it's so cold, and in this case, like you say, there's so much heat, well, that energy has to be made somewhere. And that's a correlation with price, meaning the more energy you have or the more that you can supply, the less the cost, et cetera. The less that you have, the more that it costs. And so I would imagine that people are concerned about the prices, or that the prices are going to go up that much higher when Nord Stream 1 shuts down for maintenance. So now, you said something interesting that piqued Shane's and I interest. We're closing down the coal, and I applaud that, and we're closing down the nuclear. And right now, I don't kind of applaud that. Now, and I don't live there, so, take what I'm saying as the grain of salt. You guys seem to be in a need for power, and yet you're closing down power plants.
And specifically, the nuclear power plant far earlier than the coal plant. You said the nuclear power plant's getting shut down next year, and what was the coal plant? In the 2030s, right?
2038.
2038, yes, so late 2030s. That's a long time from now. What is that, 17 years from now? Yeah, and yet nuclear is coming next year. Why is the nuclear plant getting shut down 16 years earlier than the coal plant? What is it? The Germans, I'm curious about this from your perspective.
After Fukushima, Angela Merkel said, we're not doing this anymore. And I say this is the last nuclear plant that will be closing down. All of the rest of them, I think they're already gone. I think there is only one still open.
Were they concerned about a
big
tsunami?
Policy, which will probably be a legacy policy of Angela Merkel, that she shut down these power plants without really there being a viable alternative. And there was huge issues here. I mean, I interviewed several academics who had spoke out in favor of nuclear. They'd said that they had faced basically being blackballed, being told there's no place for you if you speak out in favor of nuclear. We don't do nuclear. That's the word from the boss.
I am not.
And that's the way it is.
I'm not uber pro nuclear. I think I've taken the position that if there's something else, you use something else. By the same token, I am practical. And if your country needs power, it seems like we have this. Once we develop something else, we can get rid of this, but not get rid of it when there is still a need for it. Like, and that makes these conversations about Nord Stream 2 that much weirder.
Yeah.
It's like we're getting rid of all of this energy and gas, and we're going to fight about whether or not we're going to get gas from Russia. Are you serious? Like, it's just, it becomes, it's such an ideological position at a certain point that just runs roughshod over reality.
And I joke that are they going to have a tsunami?
Yeah, right.
But no, I get the fear. But at the same time, you said that this is I think, what was the word you used? You said legacy, but there was like a derogatory part to it, like an unpopular part of her, one of the more unpopular elements of her legacy. How does the German public feel about this?
Well, I say unpopular. I don't know if I did say unpopular, but it's quite popular. People didn't want nuclear. It's very small. I mean, they are very vocal. Those that say that we should refer to things like thorium reactors and more modern reactors that are available that don't produce the amounts of waste from converting nuclear energy into electricity in your home. But it is one of those, and you mentioned ideology over practicality, and that's quite a German thing, really. When it comes to issues like this, as far as it's concerned, as far as nuclear energy is concerned in Germany, it is done. That does mean, of course, we are in this position with talk about Nord Stream gas pipelines and gas shortages and where is the energy going to come from? Because Germany is often referred to as the economic powerhouse of Europe. That powerhouse needs power, and that power is coming from gas for the foreseeable future. Wow. While some of that will be from LNG from the US, that's a much more expensive product. It requires, shipping it over the Atlantic. Then it has to be regasified in special plants. There will be more of those plants, and there will be more LNG from the US bought into Germany. But even with that, they still need that extra pipeline from Russia.
Yeah, and it's more expensive.
It's more expensive.
A heavier expense. But Peter, before you go, I want to get into the European Army for a moment.
We'll talk about it quickly, yes. Of course.
Yes, like 30 seconds.
PESCO, as it should be called. We can't call it an EU army. They were very keen to tell us it's not that. PESCO is, of course, as I'm sure you all know, the Permanent Structured Cooperation Agreement that brings together 25 EU member states. Not everybody joined in. Denmark and Malta wanted nothing to do with it. Denmark said, we're not touching that because there's too many problems with it. Malta said, we're a neutral country, and, joining a military alliance doesn't really go well with, being neutral. That didn't stop some other neutral countries. But basically, it's not working. There was supposed to be 46 joint projects on land, on sea, in air, and in space, and in dealing with cyber attacks. And none of them are finished. None of them are, a whole load of them are nowhere near starting. And, we're hearing things from diplomats saying some of the projects were quite immature to think that we could take part in this. We're still on a learning curve. Yeah, it's not gone well. We're talking about legacy. This was a legacy project of Jean-Claude Juncker, the former EU Commission president, who'd said, we're a sleeping giant in Europe. We've got to take more charge of our defense. We've got to be able to work together in realms of defense. And at the time, particularly with Donald Trump in the White House, that seemed like a pretty decent deal to a lot of people in the EU. Donald Trump, of course, really wanted the EU members of NATO to pay what they'd essentially had agreed to pay at the meeting in Wales. That 2% of GDP that almost all of them are falling short of having done. Germany certainly is. So Trump was quite keen for them to push on with this. Joe Biden, as new US president, a little less keen on this type of thing because, he's quite happy for them to pay, for European nations to pay their way in NATO. But the idea that the US is the protector of Europe, well, that's a big part of America's back. And he's quite happy, I would have thought anyway. Obviously, I don't know what the current US president does think on these things, what he thinks in his quiet, private moments, but showing that the need for US troops is still a need when it comes to defense in Europe, that's probably going to go down well with what he's looking at with that America's back policy. And all of the speeches that we saw when Joe Biden came here to Europe back in June, and the meetings in Brussels, and of course then the summit in Geneva with Vladimir Putin. But yeah, it hasn't been a success. Not so much that it's failed, is it just hasn't really flickered into life under the new EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
Will it? Wait, real quick on this, Peter. You mentioned Jean-Claude Juncker.
Yeah.
We've only got so much time left with you, but he called it. You said sleeping giant. He referred to it as the Lisbon Treaty's Sleeping Beauty. No, you know a lot more about this than I do, but the idea is, of course, they're referring back to the fairy tale. At some point, it can be brought to life. At some point, it can be sort of resurrected from its slumbers or whatever and brought into existence. Do you see that actually happening, Peter? Or is the trouble that you're seeing about this putting it enough into a marginal position, enough into a position where NATO's continuing, this isn't relevant? Is this just going to fall by the wayside perpetually, or do you think it's possible at some point, Peter?
No, it's not. It's not possible, I don't think, because of all of the different moving parts. I think what you're going to see is some of those projects working, like the projects between France and Germany that have actually been existing for a long time, that they have basically they share not just information, but troops go on secondment to France from the Bundeswehr here in Germany and the other way around. I think that'll happen, or continue to happen. But the idea of, this involving countries to whom their neutrality is particularly a big part of their identity, countries like Ireland, like Sweden as well, Finland.
But you don't need all of the countries.
This is not going to go down well.
But you don't need all of the countries for Europe. I mean, to do something like this. Because I kind of agree. I think I agree with Juncker. The moment that you have a power or economic power, on some level, you have to defend that economic power. And Europe is depending on the United States. But I think, did Trump give them this kind of heads up of, okay, well, we can't entirely depend on the U.S., and that on any random president or any random change in the perspective can basically change the tenor of the nation. And Europe needs to have its own identity in regards to defense. What is it? The military is the beating heart of a nation. Well, how can Europe ever have a nation if it can't defend itself? And so on some level,
I think that's the idea of, is Europe ever going to be a nation? That's a very controversial thing to broach, is the idea of this ever-increasing union. It's what
ever closer.
Ever closer union. It put pay to the UK being part of the bloc. Obviously, there are groups in Italy who rumble about the idea of the Italians wanting to leave. I don't think that will happen anytime soon. I think everybody's looking across the channel and seeing the issues that are happening with the UK right now, and that's probably going to keep applications to leave the European Union very, very far down the agenda.
Fair enough. The voice that you guys were listening to is Peter Oliver. He's the EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, economic news from across the European Union. You can follow him on Twitter at PeterG.Oliver_RT and catch his reporting weekly on RT International. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan. This is typically the wrap. I'm bringing us in just to put up Cornel West. Cornel West has put out his candid letter of resignation, and he says, quote, this is his Twitter page. This is my candid letter of resignation to my Harvard dean. I try to tell the unvarnished truth about the decadence in our market-driven universities. Let us bear witness against the spiritual rot. And those are with exclamation points behind it. And there's this very long letter. I'm saying long, just because I'm looking at the page from my standpoint, that he wrote. He wrote this back June 30th, 2021. The first part. I hope and pray that your family are well, exclamation point. He likes exclamation points. This summer is a scorcher, exclamation point. Here's my brief and candid letter of resignation. And then he goes into his letter. Look, personally, it's Cornel West to me. I am biased by the gravity of that name. And so to me, it's shocking that he doesn't have tenure, that he had to ask for it, that it wasn't necessarily said, okay, well, look, you've done all of these books. You've done all of this at the university. You have this much name recognition. You drive this much. Yes, you get tenure. I don't know their standard. And so it becomes like, okay, well, how does anybody get tenure if Cornel West can't get tenure? It becomes that.
I can give some facts here. I'm just happy to see another big university getting hit by a prominent academic, just because I like seeing universities take hits. But he said that he was repeatedly passed over for pay raises, that the salary increases were as low as they possibly could be, that his classes were repeatedly put under this branch of like African-American religious teaching, and that he recently, his committee had applied for tenure recently. They'd petitioned for it or whatever, requested it, and that they had denied it to him.
I thought he said they gave it and then pulled it or something.
It's this weird thing where like his mother had died and he brought that into it, but he's also claiming that like they had acted because of comments he made about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I'm seeing a couple of things in here. I will quote him. And to witness a faculty enthusiastically support a candidate for tenure, then timidly defer to a rejection based on the Harvard administration's hostility to the Palestinian cause was disgusting. End quote.
Yeah. Because he said they extended it to him at one point, and then they pulled it back and they gave him something else that wasn't tenure.
Yes.
And so, I mean, he was like, yeah, I don't want that. Go for it. Let's go to call.
We've hit this story. We've got a couple calls, and we were late to get to the segment, so I want to get to them straight away. We get Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's on your line? What's on your mind?
Yeah, speaking of spiritual rot, I'll start off by saying, may peace be upon you, and there is no religion but God, and may peace be upon you and your prophet. And then moving on from there, I will say that Neil deGrasse Tyson is wrong. Okay, I answered a whole lot of physics questions in hospital. I think I'm qualified to speak on this topic. Without matter, there is no gravity. Without gravity, there is no heat. Without heat, there is no Big Bang. Okay, so you need matter first, then you need gravity, then you need heat, then you need a Big Bang, right? So the question is, where did this matter come from? That's the real question. The real question is, where did this matter come from? Okay? Did it just come into existence? They strongly believe. That's not a very scientific statement, if you ask me. We strongly believe. Do you know it? Is it a fact? No, we believe it. Well, I believe that matter was brought into existence by a being beyond our knowledge, and then gravity existed in a vacuum. For gravity exists in a vacuum, you have to have matter, weight, and then
Michael, I'm sorry, I'm going to cut in here. We've gone over this before with you, man. We've gone over the definition of science, and you've been like, just because they say that, I'm mischaracterizing you slightly, but basically, when scientists say we believe this is the case, we're uncertain of it, you claim that that's not scientific. I would claim that that is one of the very definitions of science, is that you stipulate your beliefs, your reasons for believing them, and you hold some uncertainty in mind in case you're wrong about it. That seems to be scientific. We've already been over this with you, Michael. I don't think in the context of Neil deGrasse Tyson, but certainly talking about physics. I don't think his name came into it. Michael, we got another caller, and we've only got so much time. Any last comments here?
Go back to David Hume, my last comment. The father of science, David Hume. Verifiable, repeatable. David Hume, father of science.
Okay, yes. Well, I don't even know that I would say he's the father of science. I would argue that Francis Bacon is more the father of science than David Hume. David Hume is more the father of modern epistemology or something like that. But point taken. And he is right. It seems like he's supporting this claim. You can't establish with certainty your knowledge of something. He kind of established that. That was what he added in a lot of ways to philosophy. You need to give your evidence for it. Anyway, Michael, thank you for the call. Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. You're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah, CNN did a report on the Haitian president being assassinated. They found out 3 of the people had ties to the U.S. Intelligence community, being informants for the DNA.
Yes, DEA specifically. I just saw that coming out this morning. I wanted to hit that. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, so that means the international journalists and the Haitian authority won't be able to investigate them or ask them any questions, because now the DHA is claiming that, you know, they want to prosecute them, this, that, and the other, even though it took place in Haiti.
It's crazy. And this is as the word is, they showed up at the compound, the assassin showed up saying they were from the DEA, and it turns out they were connected to them. And then a person connected to the doctor who apparently wanted to overthrow the president and organize this stuff, saying that the U.S. is backing him. That's the claim here. Anyway, this stuff is all coming out. We'll be covering this for sure. Thank you for the call, Tarif. Thank you, everybody, today. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan signing off. See you again tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eastern.